You are grounded until you apologize to your brother, my dad barked in front of our entire family. They all laughed. My face burned, but I only looked at him and said, "All right." The next morning he sneered, asking if I had finally learned my place. Then he noticed my room was completely empty. Before he could process that, the family lawyer stormed in trembling and shouting, "Sir, what have you done? My name is Zuri. I am 28 and work as a forensic accountant. I spent my life as the scapegoat of my wealthy church-going family in Atlanta. What they did not know was that my quiet obedience was actually a countdown." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who severely underestimated your worth. To understand how we reached that explosive morning, we have to go back to the night before. It was Thanksgiving dinner, which also doubled as the 35th anniversary celebration of our family business, Legacy Estate Management. My grandfather built the company from the ground up, and after he passed, my father Bishop Desmond took over as CEO. We gathered in the massive chandelier-lit dining room of my parents' estate in Buckhead. 20 relatives and close friends sat around a custom mahogany table filled with candied yams, collard greens, roasted turkey, and wine glasses. To the outside world, the Davis family was the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. But behind closed doors, our family dynamic was a suffocating hierarchy, and I was at the bottom. At the top of the food chain sat my older brother Terrence, 31 years old, charismatic, and entirely incompetent. Terrence was the golden child and newly appointed Chief Operating Officer. As the dinner progressed, Terrence held court loudly, boasting about his latest triumph. "I just locked down the Peachtree Plaza acquisition," he announced, swirling his expensive bourbon. "A $12 million deal. The board was nervous, but I pushed it through." My father beamed with pride, raising his glass in a toast to his namesake. My mother nodded approvingly. Sitting next to Terrence was his wife Harper, a white woman who had perfected the art of the performative ally while delivering cutting insults with a sweet southern drawl. She leaned across the table, her diamond bracelets clinking, and reached out to touch my natural hair, without asking. I pulled back slightly, but she smiled that fake sympathetic smile. "Your twist out looks so natural," Zuri Harper crooned. "It is so cute you still have your little accounting job." It must be nice to crunch numbers all day without the burden of running an empire like Terrence does. You always were the quiet, simple one. The table fell silent, a few aunts and cousins exchanging amused glances. They waited for me to lower my head and take the insult as I always had. But tonight was different. I set my fork down deliberately, picking up a linen napkin to dab the corners of my mouth. "Actually, Harper," I replied, my voice smooth, "I am a forensic accountant and senior cybersecurity auditor, and it is a very good thing I am, because that $12 million deal your husband just bragged about was a massive compliance nightmare." Terrence froze. The smug smile slid right off his face. I turned my attention to my brother, making eye contact. "You forged the environmental hazard waivers, Terrence. You bypassed escrow protocols to secure your commission early. I spent 14 hours last Tuesday buried in server logs, rewriting your disastrous financial projections and fixing encryption before federal auditors caught wind of your fraud. If I had not bailed you out today, you would be facing a federal indictment by Monday morning, and this empire would be seized." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. An uncle coughed nervously. Harper turned pale, her hand dropping back to her lap. Terrence slammed his fist onto the table, his face flushing dark with rage. "You lying little brat," he spat, pointing a finger at me. "Did not forge anything." Before I could present the receipts I had mentally prepared, my father erupted. Desmond pushed his chair back with a screech that silenced the entire room. He towered over the table, his pastoral composure completely discarded. "How dare you speak to your brother that way?" He roared, his voice booming with the same theatrical fury he used to condemn sinners from his pulpit. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter child. Terence is the future of this family. You have spent your entire life trying to tear him down because you cannot stand being in his shadow." I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. I looked at the relatives who were now chuckling under their breath, enjoying the familiar spectacle of Zuri getting put in her place. "You are grounded," Desmond barked, his face contorted with unchecked authority. He was treating a 28-year-old independent woman like a rebellious teenager. "You are grounded until you get on your knees and apologize to Terence and Harper. Go to your room down in the basement immediately and do not come out until you learn some respect." The sheer absurdity of the command hung in the air. I took a very deep breath to steady my nerves. I did not cry. I did not scream or argue. I simply stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked my father dead in the eye, gave a single slow nod, and said softly, "All right." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken my spirit one final time. They had absolutely no idea that my quiet obedience was the match that would burn their entire fraudulent empire to ground. The morning sun poured through the massive vaulted windows of the Davis family estate, casting long shadows across the imported marble floors. Desmond marched down the second-floor hallway with the heavy, authoritative footsteps of a man who believed he owned the world. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit, a smug smile playing on his lips. In his mind, he had restored the natural order of his household the night before. He had put his rebellious, ungrateful daughter back in her place. Terence was the future, the golden boy destined to inherit legacy estate management. Zuri was merely the hired help, a tool to be utilized and discarded at his convenience. Desmond reached the heavy oak door of Zuri's bedroom, fully expecting to find her sitting on the edge of her bed, properly chastised and ready to deliver a tearful apology. He grabbed the brass handle, threw the door open with dramatic force, and prepared to bark his demands. The words died in his throat. The room was entirely empty. The pristine white duvet was perfectly smoothed over the mattress, untouched. The mahogany desk where Zuri usually spent her nights crunching numbers was completely cleared. The closet doors stood wide open, revealing bare hangers swinging gently in the air-conditioning draft. There were no clothes, no shoes, no laptop, no trace that Zuri had ever lived there. Desmond stood frozen in the doorway, his arrogant smirk melting into a mask of pure confusion and rising anger. How dare she leave without his permission? He pulled his phone from his pocket, ready to summon his private security team to track her down and drag her back to face his wrath. Before his thumb could even press the call button, the heavy front doors of the mansion downstairs crashed open. Heavy, panicked footsteps echoed through the grand foyer. Desmond stormed to the top of the grand staircase, ready to unleash a holy fury on whoever dared to interrupt his morning. But it was not a rogue church member or a clumsy housekeeper. It was Mr. Davenport, the esteemed family lawyer, who had managed the Davis family affairs for 3 decades. Davenport was completely out of breath. His usually immaculate silk tie loosened his face flushed red, and sweat pouring down his forehead. He was clutching a thick leather-bound folder against his chest, as if his life depended on it. "Sir, what have you done?" Davenport shouted from the bottom of the stairs, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. Desmond scowled, descending the stairs, slowly exuding forced calm to mask his irritation. "Control yourself, Davenport. You are screaming like a madman in my house. My ungrateful daughter threw a childish temper tantrum last night, and I simply disciplined her. She has run off somewhere to sulk, but she will come crawling back when she realizes she has no money." Davenport looked at Desmond as if the bishop had just confessed to murder. The lawyer fell to his knees on the marble floor, dropping the leather folder. Documents spilled everywhere. "You fool," Davenport gasped, grabbing a specific stack of papers heavily stamped with the seal of the state of Georgia. "You absolute arrogant fool. You did not just discipline your daughter. You just handed her the keys to your entire kingdom." Desmond stopped dead on the last step. His wife Corinne, drawn by the shouting, stepped out of the kitchen holding a porcelain coffee cup. "What are you talking about?" Desmond demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Legacy Estate Management. I own this family." Davenport scrambled to his feet, shoving the documents directly into Desmond's chest. "You own nothing, Desmond. Big Papa knew. He knew you were financially incompetent and morally bankrupt long before he died." Big Papa, the legendary founder of the company and Zurich's grandfather, had never trusted Desmond's extravagant lifestyle and flashy mega-church persona. Davenport revealed the devastating truth that had been buried in highly classified legal vaults for 10 years. When Big Papa passed away, he did not leave the company to Desmond. He placed 100% of the controlling shares into an ironclad blind trust. Desmond was never the owner. He was merely a temporary placeholder, a glorified manager allowed to sit in the big chair only as long as he maintained the stability of the enterprise. Corinne dropped her coffee cup. It shattered against the floor, hot liquid splashing across her expensive designer slippers. But the true horror was yet to come. Davenport pointed a trembling finger at the most crucial paragraph on the page. "The trust has a default succession clause, Desmond. Big Papa knew Zuri was the only one in this family with the brains and the integrity to actually run the company. The clause states explicitly that if Zuri is ever evicted, disowned, or forced out of the family residence by you, the blind trust automatically dissolves. The moment you told her she was grounded and forced her out of this house, you triggered the clause. The transfer was instantaneous. As of midnight last night, Zuri legally owns 51% of Legacy Estate Management. She is your boss. You are completely at her mercy." Desmond staggered backward, the color draining from his face as the crushing reality set in. He had not punished his daughter. He had legally terminated his own reign. Standing on the second-floor landing, Terence had heard every single word. The golden child turned ghostly pale. He knew exactly what this meant. Zuri now had the legal authority to open every single ledger, every hidden account, and every offshore shell company he had created. The federal audit was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. Panic seized Terence. He sprinted down the hall to his private home office, slamming the door and locking it. His breathing was ragged as he threw open his laptop. He did not care about the company anymore. He only cared about saving his own skin. He accessed the secret dual-encrypted banking portal he used to funnel the stolen company funds. He had $3 million sitting in a shadow account. If he could just wire it to an untraceable bank in the Cayman Islands, he and Harper could flee the country before Zuri handed him over to the authorities. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the routing numbers and authorization codes. He clicked the final button to initiate the international wire transfer. The loading wheel spun for one agonizing second. Then the screen flickered. The loading bar vanished. The entire screen went pitch black. Terence frantically mashed the keys, but the laptop was completely unresponsive. Suddenly, bright red text appeared in the center of the black screen, glaring like a neon warning sign. "Access denied." Below the text, a smiling skull icon materialized, slowly rotating in a mocking loop. Terence screamed, picking up his phone to dial the offshore bank, but his mobile device displayed the exact same smiling skull. From a high-rise glass-walled office building in downtown Atlanta, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, Zuri sat comfortably in an ergonomic leather chair. She took a slow, satisfying sip of her black coffee, watching a dozen different computer monitors flash with incoming data streams. "They really thought I was just a girl who crunched numbers in a basement," she said quietly to herself, a sharp, brilliant smile lighting up her face. "I never told them that I was the principal cybersecurity architect who built their entire financial encryption network from scratch. I do not just know where the money is. I hold every single digital key, and today the locks change." Terence stared at the glowing skull on his computer screen, the red pixels reflected in his terrified eyes. He slammed his palms against the keyboard with brutal force, but nothing happened. The offshore accounts were completely sealed. $3 million sitting just out of his reach. In the adjoining master suite of their mansion, His wife Harper was loudly complaining to her personal stylist on the phone about a delayed shipment of imported silk curtains. Her shrill voice grated on his nerves, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality crashing down around them. Terrence dragged his hands down his face, feeling the cold sweat clinging to his skin. He had spent the last 3 years siphoning company funds through a labyrinth of fake vendors and inflated invoice statements. He thought he was an absolute genius. He thought he had effortlessly outsmarted his father and the entire board of directors. But he had forgotten about the one person who actually processed the numbers. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Zuri was not just a forensic accountant who balanced the books at the end of the fiscal quarter. She was the principal cybersecurity architect. 2 years ago, Desmond had refused to hire an outside security firm, claiming it was an unnecessary expense. He forced Zuri to build their financial encryption network from the ground up for absolutely no extra compensation. Desmond thought he was saving money and exploiting his daughter. In reality, he had handed her the master blueprints to every single digital vault the company owned. Zuri had designed the traps, the firewalls, and the fail-safes. Terrence grabbed his car keys and sprinted down the hallway, ignoring Harper's demands to know where he was going. He broke every speed limit, driving his imported sports car from the Buckhead estate to the gleaming glass towers of downtown Atlanta. He practically ran through the pristine lobby of the corporate headquarters, ignoring the confused greetings of the reception staff. He bypassed the executive elevator and took the stairs to the top floor, his breath burning in his lungs and his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached Zuri's new office suite. It was a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows bathing the room in bright, natural sunlight. Zuri sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk looking out over the city skyline. She did not even turn around when Terrence violently kicked the heavy oak door open. The door hit the wall with a loud, aggressive crack, but Zuri simply took a slow, satisfying sip of her black espresso. She was wearing a tailored emerald green suit, her hair perfectly styled, projecting an aura of absolute and untouchable power. "Give me the access codes!" Terrence screamed, marching across the expensive rug and slamming his hands flat on her desk. "Give me the override codes right now, Zuri, or I swear I will have security drag you out of this building." Zuri slowly turned her chair to face him. She placed her espresso cup on a coaster with deliberate precision. Her expression was dangerously calm. "You cannot fire the majority shareholder, Terrence," she said, her voice smooth and steady. "And security answers to me now. But please keep screaming. It is highly entertaining." Terrence leaned over the desk, his face inches from hers, the veins bulging in his neck. "You think you are so smart?" he spat. "You think this little stunt changes anything? Dad will tie this blind trust up in litigation for the next 10 years. You will be bankrupt before you ever see a single dime of that money. Unlock the Cayman accounts, Zuri. I am warning you." Zuri did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a thick, heavy black binder. She tossed it onto the polished mahogany surface and slid it smoothly across the desk until it bumped against Terrence's knuckles. "What is this?" he demanded, eyeing the binder as if it were a live explosive. "That is your reality check," Zuri replied, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "Open it." Terrence hesitated, his arrogant facade beginning to crack under her unwavering gaze. He opened the binder to the first page. His eyes scanned the numbers and the color instantly drained from his face. It was a complete and flawless paper trail. Every single wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, every shell company registration. Zuri had tracked every single cent. Page 12. Zuri instructed, her tone icy and precise. "You will find the $300,000 you embezzled last quarter to pay for Harper's summer wardrobe and her exclusive country club membership. Turn to page 45. That is the phantom real estate acquisition you used to buy your mistress a luxury condo in Miami. And page 82 covers the massive federal tax fraud you committed to hide the money you stole directly from the employee pension fund." Terrence stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a plush guest chair. He collapsed into it, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The binder contained enough irrefutable evidence to put him in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. It was not just a spreadsheet. It was a meticulously documented criminal timeline. "You designed the security network," Terrence whispered, his voice trembling with profound terror. "You knew about this the entire time. Why did you wait? Why did you fix the audit last week if you had all this ready to go?" "Because last week Desmond was still legally responsible for the company," Zuri explained, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the desk. "If the federal authorities had raided us last week, the company would have been dissolved, and I would have lost my inheritance entirely. I needed you and Dad to feel safe. I needed you to feel so incredibly confident in your own superiority that you would make a fatal mistake. Grounding me and trying to force me out of my own home was that mistake." Terrence stared at his sister, realizing for the first time in his miserable life that he was looking at an apex predator. He had spent his entire life treating her like a stepping stone, a convenient punching bag, to boost his own fragile ego. He had never bothered to wonder what she was building in the shadows while he basked in the spotlight. "Please!" Terrence begged, his arrogant bravado completely evaporating into thin air. "Zuri, please, Harper will leave me. I will go to jail. We are blood. We are family. You cannot do this to your own brother." Zuri stood up, her emerald suit catching the sunlight. She walked around the desk, looking down at the man who had tormented her for nearly 3 decades. She felt absolutely no pity. She felt no hesitation whatsoever. "You stole from hardworking families to buy your wife designer bags," Zuri said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth. "You endangered my future and the entire legacy of our grandfather just to fund your pathetic ego. You are not my brother Terrence. You are a financial liability, and I am simply balancing the books." She reached out and closed the binder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed loudly in the quiet office. "The guillotine has officially dropped," Zuri informed him, a cold and calculated smile playing on her lips. "You have exactly 1 hour to clean out your desk and vacate this property before I hand this binder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I suggest you start packing immediately." Terrence fled the office like a beaten dog. He did not go to the police, and he certainly did not go back to his empty desk. He ran straight to the one person who had always shielded him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. He ran to his mother. Corinne Davis was not just a pastor's wife. She was the First Lady of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling, a sprawling megachurch in the heart of Atlanta with 10,000 loyal members. When Terrence collapsed onto the velvet sofa in her private sitting room and confessed that Zuri had seized the company and frozen the offshore accounts, Corinne did not reprimand her son for embezzlement. Instead, her eyes narrowed into calculating slits. She realized instantly that they could not beat Zuri in a boardroom or a courtroom. The financial war was lost. So Corinne immediately pivoted to the battlefield where she reigned supreme: social warfare. Corinne marched into her pristine home office and adjusted her professional ring light. She smoothed her tailored crepe dress, checked her flawless makeup, and hit the Go Live button on her public Facebook page. Within seconds, thousands of church members and community followers tuned in. Corinne did not start speaking immediately. She let a few perfectly timed tears roll down her cheeks. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, projecting the image of a profoundly broken mother. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with practiced devastation. "My brothers and sisters," Corinne began, her voice dripping with sorrow. "I come to you today not as your First Lady, but as a grieving mother. We are facing a spiritual attack within our own home. My daughter Zuri has been corrupted by the spirit of greed." The comments section exploded with shocked emojis and prayers. Corinne leaned closer to the camera. "We gave that girl everything. We educated her. We loved her. But the love of money is the root of all evil. Zuri has manipulated legal loopholes to steal her grandfather's legacy right out from under her own father. She has locked her brother Terrence out in the cold, attempting to ruin his good name so she can hoard the family wealth all for herself. Please pray for my daughter. Pray that the demon of avarice releases its hold on her soul." It was a masterclass in manipulation. Corinne weaponized her religious authority to completely invert the truth. She knew her congregation would swallow every word without asking for a single financial document. But the smear campaign did not stop with the older generation. Harper, realizing her luxury lifestyle was evaporating, decided to launch her own coordinated attack targeting a younger secular demographic. Harper set up her smartphone in the corner of her beige, minimalist living room. She sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest to look small and vulnerable. She hit record for TikTok. Harper did not use religious rhetoric. She used weaponized therapy speak. Speaking in a soft, breathless voice, Harper played the ultimate white savior. "Hey guys," Harper whispered to her camera, wiping a non-existent tear. "I am dealing with a really toxic family situation right now, and I just need a safe space to process. My sister-in-law Zuri is exhibiting severe narcissistic behavior. She is projecting her generational trauma onto my husband and trying to financially abuse us. I have always tried to be an ally to Zuri. I know navigating corporate spaces as a Black woman is hard, but her hostility has become dangerous. I am just sending her healing energy and setting firm boundaries to protect my peace." Harper posted the video with a series of mental health hashtags. Within an hour, the algorithm picked it up. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the Davis family flooded the comments praising Harper for her bravery and condemning the angry, toxic sister-in-law. Back in her downtown high-rise office, Zura's phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany desk. It buzzed once, then twice, then shifted into a relentless, continuous hum. Zuri calmly picked up the device. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. She had hundreds of text messages, direct messages, and missed calls. She opened a few of them just to gauge the temperature of the mob. "How could you do this to the bishop?" Read a text from Auntie Brenda, the church's lead choir director. "You are a traitor to your own blood," read another from a woman Zuri had known since Sunday school. A former high school friend messaged her calling her a greedy Jezebel who was tearing a holy family apart. The community she had grown up in, the people who had watched her sit quietly in the front pew every Sunday for 2 decades, had turned on her in a matter of minutes. They did not ask for her side of the story. They simply followed the First Lady's command to attack. Any normal person would have broken down under the sheer volume of public hatred. Being ostracized by your entire community and publicly branded a thief by your own mother is designed to break a person's psychology. But Zuri simply locked her phone screen and tossed it back onto the desk. She did not shed a single tear. She did not feel an ounce of panic. She felt exactly what she had trained herself to feel over years of enduring their emotional abuse. Absolutely nothing. Zuri turned her attention away from the silent phone and looked at the glowing monitors spread across her desk. While Corinne and Harper were busy performing for their cameras, they had completely forgotten a vital piece of family history. 5 years ago, Bishop Desmond had refused to pay a professional IT firm to upgrade the megachurch's outdated server network. He had forced Zuri to do it for free over a holiday weekend, claiming it was her tithe to the ministry. Zuri had built their entire digital infrastructure. She owned the administrative access to the church's audiovisual system, their financial ledgers, and their broadcast servers. Zuri leaned back in her leather chair, interlocking her fingers. She stared at the flashing cursor on her command terminal, perfectly composed in the face of absolute social ruin. She cracked her knuckles, the sharp popping sound echoing loudly in the quiet glass-walled office. She tilted her head, staring at the live feed of her father's upcoming Sunday service schedule. "Let us take them to church," Zuri murmured to the empty room. The Cathedral of the Higher Calling was packed to the rafters that Sunday morning. 3,000 congregants filled the velvet-padded pews, dressed in their finest clothes, completely unaware that they were about to witness the spectacular destruction of their beloved pastor. The atmosphere in the massive sanctuary was electric. Desmond paced the sprawling stage under the hot theatrical lights, sweat glistening on his forehead. He gripped a white monogrammed towel in one hand and a gold-edged Bible in the other, working the crowd into a spiritual frenzy. He was delivering a fiery, hypocritical sermon, meticulously designed to assassinate his daughter's character without ever saying her name. He spoke of the prodigal child, the venom of greed, and the ultimate betrayal of family loyalty. "We must protect our homes from the rot of entitlement," Desmond bellowed into his wireless microphone, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. When a branch becomes poisoned by selfishness, when a child turns against the very blood that nourished them, we must have the strength to prune that branch. We must cast out the demon of avarice to save the family tree. The congregation responded with a chorus of amens and hallelujahs completely under his manipulative spell. In the front row, Corinne dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. Beside her, Terence and Harper sat with their heads bowed in mock solemnity, soaking in the sympathy of the surrounding church members. Miles away in her quiet glass-walled office, Zuri watched the live broadcast on her center monitor. She did not feel angry as she listened to her father paint her as a demon. She just felt a cold surgical precision. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. She had waited for this exact moment. She had waited for him to reach the absolute climax of his self-righteous performance. "We cannot let thieves hide in our sanctuary," Desmond roared, raising his hand toward the heavens. "We must demand transparency and truth." Zuri hit the enter key. Inside the megachurch, the massive 60-foot jumbotron behind the altar violently glitched. The high-definition live feed of Desmond's sweating face dissolved into jagged green static. The audio feed cut out, instantly silencing Desmond's booming voice and replacing it with a sharp electronic hum that made the front row wince. Desmond tapped his microphone, looking annoyed. He gestured angrily toward the sound booth at the back of the sanctuary, expecting the technicians to fix the issue. But the technicians were locked out. Zuri had remotely severed their access credentials. The static on the jumbotron cleared, but it did not return to the sermon. Instead, the giant screen illuminated the dark sanctuary with a blinding white light. A document appeared, magnified to 60 feet wide. It was a high-definition bank statement. A murmur of confusion rippled through the 3,000 attendees. People squinted, adjusting their glasses to read the crisp black text scrolling across the screen. Zuri had highlighted the crucial rows in bright, undeniable yellow. The first document belonged to Terence. It showed a lease agreement for a $200,000 imported sports car. The routing number paying the monthly installment was displayed right next to it, clearly labeled as the Cathedral Orphanage Outreach Fund. The crowd gasped. Before anyone could process the theft, the screen flashed to the next document. It was a country club invoice, $75,000 for a platinum tier initiation fee at the most exclusive, predominantly white country club in Buckhead. The name on the membership was Harper Davis. The funding source paying the fee was the Cathedral Building Maintenance Escrow account. The murmurs in the pews transformed into angry, rising voices. Desmond spun around to look at the screen. The color completely drained from his face. He dropped his gold-edged Bible. "Cut the feed," he screamed, his voice cracking without the microphone. "Turn it off right now." The security team scrambled toward the sound booth, but there was nothing they could do. Zuri was overriding the system through a ghost server they did not even know existed. The final document flashed onto the screen. It was an aviation charter log. 3 different private jet rentals for weekend trips to the Bahamas and St. Bart's. The passenger listed was Bishop Desmond Davis. The payment was drawn directly from the Cathedral Tithes and Offerings master account. The sanctuary erupted. 3,000 people who had sacrificed their hard-earned money, who had written checks they could barely afford because they believed in this ministry, stared at the undeniable proof that they were funding a criminal enterprise. Women who had been crying in sympathy for Corinne just moments before were now standing up and shouting. Men were pointing at the stage. The choir members behind Desmond began stepping backward, putting physical distance between themselves and their disgraced pastor. Desmond stood frozen under the stage lights, completely exposed. Corinne remained glued to the front pew, her mouth hanging open in sheer terror. Terence grabbed Harper's arm, his eyes darting around for an exit, realizing they were surrounded by an angry mob. Then the giant screen went entirely black. For one brief second, the church fell silent, anticipating that the technical difficulties were finally over. But Zuri was not finished. The speakers crackled to life, sending a clear, crisp audio file echoing through the massive sanctuary. It was not a bank statement. It was a voicemail recording. The voice filling the church belonged unmistakably to Harper. Gone was the sweet, breathy tone she used for her performative social media videos. Her voice was sharp, arrogant, and dripping with disdain. "I cannot believe we have to go back to that sweaty building tomorrow," Harper's recorded voice echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system. "Terrence, your father's congregation is so incredibly ghetto. It is actually pathetic how gullible they are. Just pass around a gold plate, and they hand over their grocery money without asking a single question. It pays for my Pilates, though, so let them sing their little songs." The silence that followed the audio clip was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that immediately precedes an explosion. And then the cathedral of the higher calling descended into total chaos. The outrage was deafening. Church programs and offering envelopes rained down on the stage. A wave of furious congregants pushed toward the front, shouting demands for their money back. The usher team, completely disillusioned by what they had just heard, did not even try to hold the crowd back. Harper shrieked, covering her face with her designer handbag as a furious church auntie lunged toward her pew. Terrence shoved his way into the center aisle, dragging his panicking wife toward the side exit, while congregants cursed at them. Corinne abandoned her majestic First Lady persona, entirely hiking up her expensive crepe dress and fleeing toward the backstage stairs to save herself. Desmond was left completely alone on the stage, looking out over the sea of rage he had created. His empire of lies had been burned to the ground in exactly 3 minutes. In her quiet downtown office, Zuri watched the chaos unfold on her monitors. She did not smile. She simply closed the software application and locked her terminal. The social warfare had been neutralized by undeniable facts. But Zuri knew her family too well. They were arrogant, cornered animals, and they would not go down without trying to drag her into the mud with them. Right on cue, her private phone rang. It was Davenport, the family lawyer, calling from a secure line. He sounded terrified as he warned her that Desmond was mobilizing his attack dog attorneys for a massive defamation lawsuit. Zuri disconnected the secure line just as the heavy oak doors of her executive boardroom swung open with a violent crash. Heavy, aggressive footsteps hammered against the hardwood floor. Desmond marched into the room, flanked by a phalanx of expensive predatory lawyers in custom-tailored charcoal suits. He moved with the desperate, manufactured confidence of a cornered tyrant who believed he could still bully his way to victory. He flanked himself with men whose hourly billing rates could buy small islands, intending to physically and psychologically intimidate his daughter into submission. The lead attorney, an imposing man with slicked-back hair and a permanent sneer, stepped forward and slammed a massive stack of legal documents onto the center of the polished glass table. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the cavernous room. Desmond stood tall behind him, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked down at Zuri, expecting to see fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw only mild amusement. "We are filing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against you first thing tomorrow morning," Zuri, Desmond declared, his voice dripping with venom. "You have humiliated me. You have humiliated your mother, and you have committed federal crimes to do it." The lead attorney tapped the thick stack of papers with a manicured finger. "The charges are extensive, Miss Davis. Corporate espionage, felony cyberterrorism, unauthorized access to protected digital networks, malicious destruction of property, and massive defamation of character. You illegally hacked into the private servers of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling. You doctored financial documents to smear your father, and you broadcasted fabricated audio files to thousands of people. You are facing decades in federal prison." Desmond leaned over the table, placing his knuckles on the glass. "But I am a merciful man, Zuri. I am still a man of God. I am willing to show you grace if you do exactly as I say. You will sign over your 51% controlling stake in Legacy Estate Management immediately. You will publicly confess that you suffered a severe mental breakdown and fabricated the evidence against me and Terrence. You will relinquish your position and walk away. If you do that, I will tell my legal team to drop this lawsuit, and I will not press criminal charges." For a long moment, the boardroom was perfectly silent. The high-priced lawyers stood with their arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the young woman sitting across from them. Zuri looked at the towering stack of legal threats. Then she looked up at her father, and she laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a hysterical one. It was a rich, genuine, and utterly chilling sound that immediately wiped the smug satisfaction right off Desmond's face. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair and slowly steepled her fingers. "You really should have read the fine print before you paid these gentlemen their exorbitant retainers," Dad Zuri said smoothly. She reached into a sleek leather portfolio resting beside her coffee cup and pulled out a remarkably thin folder. It contained only 5 pages of documents. She tossed it casually across the table. It slid over the smooth glass and stopped right in front of the lead attorney. The lawyer picked it up, his brow furrowing as he scanned the first page. Within seconds, the aggressive sneer vanished from his face. His eyes widened, and he hurriedly flipped to the second page, his posture completely deflated. "What is it?" Desmond demanded, snapping his fingers at the lawyer. "What does it say?" The attorney swallowed hard, looking at Desmond with a mixture of shock and extreme professional irritation. "Sir, these are limited liability company registration papers and deeds of ownership." Zuri stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald blazer. 5 years ago, you refused to pay an outside firm to upgrade the church and company networks. She explained, her voice ringing with absolute authority. You forced me to do it. But what you did not know was that Big Papa saw exactly what you were doing. My grandfather knew you were too cheap and too ignorant to understand digital security. So before he died, he secretly gave me $2 million in seed money. I used it to establish my own private data infrastructure firm. Desmond stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Those servers that hold the church's financial data. Zuri continued, walking slowly around the table. The cloud architecture that houses legacy estate management's accounts. They do not belong to the church. They do not belong to the company. They belong to my data firm. You have been paying a third-party vendor fee for 5 years. Desmond, and you never once bothered to look at who owned the vendor company. You signed the service contracts yourself. She stopped right in front of him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. I did not hack anything. I did not breach a protected network. As the supreme administrator and legal owner of the physical hardware and the digital architecture, I simply logged into my own property. I opened my own files. Your lawyers cannot sue me for trespassing in my own house. The lead attorney carefully set the folder down on the table and took a distinct step away from Desmond. Zuri turned her sharp gaze to the legal team. Furthermore, gentlemen, since you are supposed to be legal experts, I am sure you are fully aware that truth is an absolute defense to defamation. Zuri stated, her tone razor sharp. If you file that ridiculous lawsuit, you will trigger the discovery phase. Everything goes to discovery. Every single receipt, every offshore wire transfer, every luxury car payment, and every private jet rental will be subpoenaed by a federal judge. If you try to sue me for defamation, I will gladly welcome it because it makes my father's massive embezzlement a matter of federal public record. The lawyers exchanged panicked glances. They were sharks, but they were not suicidal. They instantly recognized a completely unwinnable case. The lead attorney quickly gathered the massive stack of papers he had just slammed down. Mr. Davis, we cannot proceed with this litigation, the lawyer said tersely, shoving the documents back into his briefcase. We have no legal standing, and filing this suit would constitute professional malpractice on our part, given the discovery risks. We are done here. The legal team turned and marched right out of the boardroom, leaving Desmond standing completely alone. The trap had snapped shut. There was no legal maneuver, no church sermon, and no social media manipulation that could save him now. He was entirely stripped of his armor, facing the brilliant daughter he had underestimated for his entire life. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving Zuri alone in the sprawling boardroom. She did not celebrate. She simply walked back to her desk, smoothed her emerald skirt, and sat down. The silence in the office was a stark contrast to the absolute meltdown happening across the city. The great Bishop Desmond Davis had been castrated by his own hubris, and his legal mercenaries had fled the battlefield. But Zuri knew the war was not entirely over. Rats always scramble when the ship starts sinking, and the Davis family was a nest of highly predictable rodents. Right on cue, her private unlisted cell phone began to ring. Zuri glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Harper Davis. Zuri let it ring 3 times. She reached across her desk, opened a highly encrypted audio recording application on her main monitor, and verified that the microphone input was capturing crystal clear sound. She tapped the screen to answer, placing the phone on speaker. Zuri, oh my God, thank you so much for answering. Harper gasped. Her voice was trembling thick with heavy theatrical tears. Zuri leaned back in her chair, keeping her own voice completely neutral. What do you want, Harper? Across town in the Buckhead mansion, Harper was not sitting in a peaceful, serene living room, projecting healing energy. She was frantically pacing the length of her custom-built 2-story walk-in closet. She was surrounded by walls of Hermes handbags, rows of imported silk dresses, and shelves of diamond-encrusted stilettos. She was desperately throwing velvet jewelry boxes into a massive Louis Vuitton suitcase. Her hands shook with pure, unadulterated panic. Terrence was downstairs tearing his home office apart, screaming at his dormant laptop, completely unaware that his wife was upstairs orchestrating his final execution. Zuri, you have to listen to me, Harper pleaded, forcing a dramatic sob into the receiver. I am terrified. Terrence is completely unhinged. I am setting firm boundaries to protect my peace, but his narcissistic abuse is escalating. I am a victim in this house. He lied to me about everything. I had absolutely no idea he was doing those terrible things to you in the church. Zuri watched the audio waveforms spike on her monitor. She took a slow sip of her espresso. You posted a video 2 hours ago calling me a troubled, toxic woman who needed prayers, Harper. You claimed I was financially abusing your husband. I had to do that. Harper cried, her voice pitching higher in a desperate attempt to sound fragile. Terrence forced me. He was gaslighting me into believing his truth. You know how hard it is to navigate a toxic patriarchal environment. We are both women trying to survive his generational trauma. But I see the reality now, Zuri. I want to be your ally. I want to help you take him down. Zuri traced the rim of her coffee cup. The audacity was almost impressive. Harper was dropping the loyal wife act, entirely pivoting from a white savior to a helpless victim in record time. How exactly do you plan to help me, Harper? Harper stopped pacing. She looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The tears instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. I know you froze the offshore accounts. I know you locked him out of the Cayman banks. But you do not have everything, Zuri. Terrence is paranoid. He did not put all the stolen pension money into traditional banks. He converted a massive chunk of it into untraceable cryptocurrency. He has shadow wallets buried on offline servers. Millions of dollars that you cannot see on your neat little spreadsheets. Zuri went perfectly still. She knew there were discrepancies in the final audit, a missing margin that she had not yet pinpointed. Harper was holding the final piece of the puzzle. And you know how to access these crypto wallets? Zuri asked, her tone shifting to feigned curiosity. I hold the primary security keys, Harper stated, her voice dropping the therapy speak entirely. Her tone was now entirely transactional. Terrence is an idiot. He trusted me to manage the digital security phrases because he was too busy managing his mistress in Miami. I have the ledger. I have the passwords. I can hand you exactly what you need to put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his miserable life. That is very generous of you, Zuri murmured, tapping her manicured nails against the desk. But we both know you do not do anything out of the goodness of your heart. What is your asking price? I need a severance package, Harper demanded without missing a beat. My reputation is going to take a hit when this divorce goes public. I am leaving this toxic marriage, but I absolutely refuse to leave empty-handed. I want $2 million transferred into a secure private account in my name. You give me the cash to walk away comfortably, and I will hand over the crypto keys and testify against Terrence in open court. Zuri smiled. The trap was perfectly set. She just needed Harper to walk blindly into it. $2 million is a massive payout for a bystander, Harper. If I'm going to buy this information, I need to know the merchandise is authentic. How do I know you actually have the security phrases? Terrence would never hand over the master keys to the stolen funds unless you were directly involved in the theft. Harper scoffed, her arrogance completely overriding her basic survival instincts. Of course I was involved, Zuri. Who do you think set up the shell companies in the first place? Terrence does not know the first thing about corporate tax evasion. I registered the fake vendors. I signed the falsified tax forms for the federal government. I personally initiated the wire transfers from my private laptop to wash the church pension funds before converting them into crypto. I was the one covering his tracks while he played the big shot executive. I hold the keys because I built the vault. Zuri watched the audio recording software capture every single syllable. The glowing green line pulsed on the screen, locking in a full, uncoerced, highly detailed confession to federal tax fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. Harper had just gleefully outlined her exact role in a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. "You signed the federal tax forms yourself," Zuri asked, ensuring the admission was explicitly clear on the tape. "Every single one of them," Harper bragged, zipping her luxury suitcase shut. "I forged the vendor invoices and approved the pension withdrawals. I have the hard copies in my personal safe. Now, do we have a deal or not, Zuri? I need that $2 million wired by midnight so I can catch a flight to Paris before the feds show up at this house." Zuri slowly reached forward and clicked the save button on the recording software. The file instantly encrypted and backed up to 3 separate secure cloud servers. She leaned into the microphone. "We do not have a deal," Harper Zuri said, her voice dropping to a terrifying absolute chill. "But I do have your full confession." The line went dead silent. Harper stopped breathing. The blood rushed out of her head, leaving her completely dizzy. What Harper choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "You did not just confess to me," Harper Zuri stated smoothly. "You just provided a detailed recorded confession of your direct complicity in federal wire fraud and money laundering. You are not a victim. You are a co-conspirator. And I am not giving you a severance package. I am giving this audio file to the FBI White-Collar Crime Division in exactly 5 minutes." Harper let out a guttural, panicked shriek. "Zuri, you cannot do this. We are allies. I am giving you Terrence." "You are giving me exactly what I already have," Zuri replied. "I do not need your help to find the crypto wallets, Harper. I just needed you to admit that you helped steal the money. You thought you could play the white savior on the internet and then extort a black woman in private. Your performance is officially over." Zuri ended the call. She did not block the number. She wanted Harper to panic, to call back, begging to realize that her luxury lifestyle was instantly replaced by the terrifying certainty of a federal prison sentence. Zuri exported the audio file, attached it to an email addressed to the lead investigator at the regional FBI field office, and hit send. 10 miles away, the deafening silence in the master closet of the Buckhead mansion was shattered by the chime of an incoming text. Harper frantically snatched up her phone, expecting a wire transfer confirmation. Instead, she stared at a single audio file sent from Zuri, accompanied by a red receipt from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Harper let out a guttural, hyperventilating sob, dropping the phone onto the plush carpet. The device clattered loudly, drawing the attention of Terrence, who had just stormed up the stairs to demand why she was packing her luxury luggage. He stepped into the closet, his face flushed with manic rage from his earlier defeat. He looked at his wife, then down at the illuminated screen of the phone lying at his feet. The audio file was still playing. His own wife's voice echoed off the custom shelving, bragging about forging vendor invoices and hiding pension funds in offshore crypto wallets. Terrence froze. The realization struck him with the force of a freight train. Harper had not just prepared to leave him, she had attempted to sell him to the slaughterhouse for a comfortable severance package. "You treacherous parasite!" Terrence roared, lunging toward the phone. Harper screamed, shrinking back against a wall of designer shoes. She did not bother to defend herself or apologize. She simply grabbed her heavy Louis Vuitton suitcase, shoved past her husband, and sprinted down the grand staircase, leaving Terrence standing completely alone in the wreckage of their marriage. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the empty mansion. Terrence gripped the edge of a mahogany dresser, his breathing ragged and shallow. In his distorted, narcissistic mind, none of this was his fault. It was not his greed that had destroyed his life. It was not his reckless embezzlement or his infidelity. It was Zuri. Zuri had poisoned his father. Zuri had manipulated the blind trust. Zuri had turned his wife against him. A dangerous, unhinged desperation took hold of him. He convinced himself that if he could just get his hands on his sister, if he could physically force her to sign a legal retraction and transfer the company shares back into his name, he could stop the bleeding. He could still win. Terrence practically flew down the stairs. He ignored his sleek sports car and jumped into a heavy reinforced luxury SUV. He tore out of the estate gates, his tires shredding the immaculate landscaping. He drove through the Atlanta streets like a madman, running red lights and weaving violently through traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He knew exactly where Zuri had moved after Desmond threw her out. She had purchased a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse in the heart of Midtown, a fortress in the sky that she paid for with her own legitimate hard-earned money. When Terrence reached the high-rise, he did not bother with the main lobby or the concierge. He slipped through the underground delivery bay, tailgating a maintenance worker into the restricted freight elevator. He hammered the button for the top floor, pacing the small metal box like a caged animal. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against a folded stack of legal documents he had hastily printed from his home office. A complete transfer of ownership. He was going to make her sign it no matter what it took. The elevator doors slid open. Terrence marched down the pristine carpeted hallway until he reached the double-glass doors of Zuri's penthouse. He did not ring the bell. He did not knock. He took a few steps back, raised his heavy leather boot, and kicked the center of the glass with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed on the first strike. Terrence roared, kicking it again and again. On the fourth impact, the door shattered, raining sharp, heavy shards across the imported hardwood floors inside. Terrence stormed through the broken entryway, his heavy boots crunching over the glass. His eyes were wild, his suit jacket torn, and a thin line of blood trickled down his cheek from flying debris. "Where are you?" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the massive sunlit living room. "You think you can steal my life? You think you can ruin my marriage? Sign the papers, Zuri. Sign the damn papers right now, or I swear I will make you regret the day you were born." He rounded the corner into the main living space, brandishing the crumpled legal documents like a weapon. He expected to see his sister cowering in a corner, terrified by his violent, unpredictable rage. He expected the quiet, submissive girl he had bullied their entire childhood. Instead, Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. Zuri was sitting comfortably on a plush, emerald green velvet sofa. She was not trembling. She was not crying. She was casually holding a delicate porcelain cup of espresso, the steam curling lazily into the cool air conditioning. And she was not alone. Sitting in the matching armchairs directly across from Zuri were two men in sharp, inconspicuous dark suits. They both held thick, government-issued manila folders resting on their laps. Terrence's violent momentum hit a sudden invisible wall. The sheer terrifying stillness of the room completely neutralized his screaming rage. Zuri took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso. She placed the cup on the glass coffee table and looked at her brother with a chilling, detached calm. "Terrence, you are exceptionally bad at timing," Zuri said, her voice smooth and devoid of any fear. "I would offer you a seat, but I am currently in the middle of a rather important meeting." The two men in the dark suits stood up in unison. They did not look surprised by the shattered glass or the bleeding, frantic man standing before them. They simply reached into their suit jackets. Terrence flinched instinctively, taking a step backward, but they did not pull out guns immediately. They pulled out golden badges that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Terrence Davis, the taller man, stated, his voice a deep, authoritative rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "I am Special Agent Vance, and this is Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division." The blood drained from Terrence's face so fast he actually swayed on his feet. The crumpled transfer documents slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering uselessly to the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic manufactured excuse, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. "We were just sitting here going over the final parameters of your federal indictment," Agent Miller added, his eyes narrowing as he took in the broken door and Terrence's aggressive posture. "Your sister was incredibly cooperative. She handed over a highly detailed audio confession from your wife, along with 50 pages of irrefutable digital ledgers documenting massive corporate tax fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of church pension funds. Terence looked at Zuri. She simply tilted her head, a cold, victorious smile playing on her lips. She had not just beaten him, she had utterly eradicated him. Agent Vance unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink sounded louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. You were already facing 20 years for the financial charges, Mr. Davis. But since you just violently kicked down a reinforced door and threatened a key federal witness in our presence, we will go ahead and tack on breaking and entering, destruction of property, and attempted assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Agent Miller commanded, his hand dropping to the holster at his hip. Do it right now. Terrence's knees buckled. He sank to the glass-covered floor, submitting to the cold steel locking around his wrists. He did not look at the agents reading him his rights. He looked at Zuri, the sister he had called worthless, the sister he had treated like an uninvited guest in their family. She looked back at him, her posture perfect, her crown fully restored as the authorities dragged the golden boy out of her home and out of her life forever. Terrence's screams faded down the corridor as the heavy elevator doors slid shut, sealing his fate and plunging the penthouse back into a sharp, ringing silence. The shattered, reinforced glass of Zuri's front entryway glittered across the imported hardwood floors like crushed ice under the afternoon sun. Zuri did not flinch. She simply set her espresso cup down, stepped over the jagged debris, and called a premium private security firm to board up the door and post an armed guard in the hallway. The federal machine was officially in motion, and the physical threat of her brother had been neutralized. The authorities had their man. But Zuri knew the emotional warfare was far from over. Less than 24 hours later, the intercom on Zuri's desk buzzed with a quiet urgency. The private security detail stationed downstairs announced a visitor requesting immediate access. It was Corinne. Zuri authorized the clearance without a second thought. She wanted to see exactly how the formidable matriarch of the Davis Empire would play this unwinnable hand. When Corinne stepped into the penthouse, escorted by the hallway guard, she was entirely unrecognizable. The majestic, untouchable First Lady of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling was gone. Her signature silk wraps, her immaculate tailored suits, and her flawless camera-ready makeup had vanished. In their place stood a woman wearing a rumpled trench coat, her eyes swollen, bloodshot, and frantic. She looked incredibly small, completely stripped of the divine authority she usually wielded from the church pulpit. Corinne did not yell when she saw her daughter. She did not threaten hellfire or eternal damnation. Instead, she resorted to the most insidious manipulative tactic in her extensive arsenal. She walked slowly toward the center of the sunlit living room, her knees visibly buckling. With a dramatic, trembling gasp, she dropped heavily to the floor right at Zuri's feet. A tight, uncomfortable focus could be drawn on Corinne's desperate, tear-streaked face as she grabbed the hem of Zuri's emerald blazer. Her chest heaved with manufactured agony, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently. Slowly, the perspective would tilt down to reveal Zuri's absolute chilling indifference. Zuri remained seated on her velvet sofa, her posture rigid, her expression carved from stone. She looked down at the weeping woman with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist observing a highly predictable experiment. Zuri, please. Corinne sobbed, her voice cracking as she leaned into the ultimate guilt trip. You have to stop this. You have to call those agents and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you were angry, and you exaggerated the numbers. They have Terrence locked in a federal holding cell. Do you know what they do to black men in that system? They will bury your brother. They will lock him in a cage and throw away the key just to make an example out of him. We have to protect our black men from the system, Zuri. We cannot hand him over to them. Corinne tightened her grip on Zuri's jacket, her tears staining the expensive fabric. Think about our family. Corinne pleaded, her voice rising in a desperate crescendo. Think about the legacy your father built from nothing. The media is going to parade your brother around in handcuffs. They love nothing more than tearing down a strong, successful black family. They will destroy our image. They will destroy everything we represent to the community. You are tearing our people apart. You have to drop these charges. Zuri did not pull away immediately. She let her mother weep, absorbing the sheer blinding hypocrisy of the performance. She felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt, no lingering daughterly sympathy, and no hesitation. There was only a profound, clarifying disgust. This was the woman who had watched her husband and son belittle Zuri for decades. This was the mother who had constantly demanded that Zuri shrink herself, silence her brilliance, and hide her success just so Terrence could shine. And now, when the golden boy was finally facing the catastrophic consequences of his own spectacular greed, Corinne was daring to weaponize race systemic injustice and community trauma to shield him from accountability. Zuri reached down and firmly, meticulously pried her mother's fingers off her blazer. She stood up, stepping back and forcing Corinne to look up at her from the floor. "Do not you dare use the community as a shield for his crimes," Zuri said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that echoed through the quiet penthouse. "Do not you dare invoke the very real struggles of black men in the justice system to protect a spoiled, arrogant thief who had every single advantage in the world and still chose to steal." Corinne gasped, putting a trembling hand over her mouth, but Zuri refused to let her speak. "Terrence is not a victim of the system." Mother Zuri continued, stepping closer, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "He is the system. He did not care about protecting black people when he was draining the retirement accounts of the elderly women in your congregation. He did not care about the community when he stole millions of dollars from hardworking, faithful black families who trusted your ministry with their last dimes. He took their tithes, their grocery money, and their rent money. And what did he do with it? He used it to buy his performative white wife designer bags, platinum country club memberships, and imported sports cars. He robbed his own people to fund a counterfeit billionaire lifestyle. But he is your brother." Corinne wept, shaking her head in frantic denial, crawling forward on her knees. "He is your blood. You are supposed to protect your blood. You cannot let them take him away." "I am protecting myself," Zuri replied coldly, staring down at the broken matriarch. "You and Dad spent my entire life grooming me to be the sacrificial scapegoat for Terrence's fragile ego. You demanded my silence to protect his reputation. You demanded my labor to fund his luxury. You thought you could just keep feeding me to him forever, expecting me to bleed out quietly so the Davis men could look untouchable. I absolutely refuse to be the sacrificial lamb for this family ever again." Terrence dug his own grave and he jumped right in. "I simply removed the dirt so the feds could finally see the body." Zuri stepped around her weeping mother and walked toward the heavy wooden doors that separated the living room from her private home office. She paused with her hand on the brass handle, glancing back over her shoulder at the sobbing woman on her floor. "The FBI already has the audio tapes, the bank statements, and the offshore crypto keys," Zuri stated, driving the final nail into the coffin. "Harper sold him out for a chance to escape, and I recorded her entire confession. It is completely out of my hands now. It is over, Mother. I suggest you go home and call a very good defense attorney for yourself. Because when Terrence realizes he is facing 20 years in federal prison, he is going to tell those agents exactly who helped him forge the church tax documents." Zuri stepped into her office and let the door click shut behind her, locking it securely. She walked to her desk, leaving Corinne alone on the floor, to drown in the absolute wreckage of the fraudulent empire she had helped corrupt. 72 hours later, the heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse had been replaced by the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned atmosphere of Davenport's downtown law firm. The sprawling conference room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, but the energy inside the room was entirely claustrophobic. Desmond sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his bespoke suit immaculate, his posture radiating a manufactured, arrogant confidence. Corinne sat rigidly beside him. The desperate, weeping woman who had crawled on Zuri's floor was completely gone, replaced once again by the haughty, untouchable First Lady, staring straight ahead with cold, unblinking eyes. Davenport sat across from them, looking visibly older and deeply stressed. He nervously adjusted his tie, shuffling a stack of thick manila folders. Zuri sat at the opposite end of the table, perfectly still, waiting for whatever desperate final theatrical performance her parents had choreographed. "You thought you could destroy this family, Zuri," Desmond declared, breaking the tense silence. His voice carried the booming authoritative cadence of his Sunday sermons. "You thought you could hand your brother over to the federal government and steal the legacy I built with my own 2 hands. But God always provides a ram in the bush. The truth always comes to the light." Desmond snapped his fingers. Davenport flinched slightly before sliding a pristine, age-yellowed envelope across the smooth surface of the table. It came to rest right in front of Zuri. "Your father presented this to my office yesterday morning," Zuri Davenport explained, his voice tight and overly formal. "It was allegedly discovered secured behind a false wooden panel in your grandfather's old study at the church estate. We have spent the last 24 hours reviewing it." Zuri reached out and opened the envelope. She slid the heavy textured parchment out and placed it flat on the glass table. It claimed to be a superseding last will and testament dated and executed exactly 3 days before her grandfather's fatal heart attack. The terms outlined on the page were absolute. It explicitly dissolved the blind trust, permanently stripped Zuri of all executive authority over legacy estate management, and transferred 100% of the corporate assets, liquid funds, and real estate holdings directly to Terrence. "It voids everything, Zuri." Desmond leaned forward, a malicious, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "Your little data firm does not matter if the underlying company belongs entirely to your brother. This document legally supersedes your position. We are going to liquidate the corporate assets post Terrence's bail and hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys to tie your federal friends up in civil litigation for the next 2 decades. You are completely finished. You have absolutely nothing." "I have examined the document thoroughly," Zuri Davenport interjected, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "I must admit it appears highly legitimate. The notary seal belongs to a clerk who worked for your grandfather for over 20 years. The letterhead matches his vintage stationery. And the signature is an exact, flawless match to Theodore Davis. Legally speaking, if this holds up in probate, the blind trust is entirely dissolved." Zuri did not panic. She did not raise her voice or show the slightest hint of defeat. She simply leaned forward and pulled the heavy parchment closer to her face. The paper felt right under her fingertips. The letterhead was indeed an exact match. The signature looked perfectly fluid, the loops and sharp angles an exact, undeniable replica of the man who had raised her. But Zuri was not just an estate manager. She was a brilliant data architect, a woman who had spent her entire professional life hunting for microscopic discrepancies in massive, complex systems. She leaned in closer, her razor-sharp eyes narrowing as she inspected the dark blue ink of her grandfather's signature. She slowly tilted the paper, catching the bright glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. Something was fundamentally wrong with the physical texture of the ink. It did not bleed naturally into the porous fibers of the aged parchment the way fluid ink from a pen should. Instead, it sat unnaturally flat, resting directly on top of the paper surface with a faint glossy sheen. Zuri traced her manicured fingernail lightly over the signature. It was completely smooth. There was absolutely no indentation, no physical groove pressed into the paper from the heavy pressure of a pen nib. Zuri slowly sat back in her chair. A cold, predatory smile spread across her face. "You really should have paid a professional forger," Dad Zuri said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute chill. "Because this is an absolute embarrassment." Desmond's smirk instantly vanished. "What are you talking about?" Davenport verified it. "It is his signature." "It is his signature," Zuri agreed, tapping her fingernail against the parchment. "It is a flawless, high-resolution scan of his signature, likely pulled from a legitimate church document and printed directly onto old stationery using a modern commercial color laser printer. If you look closely at the edges of the ink, you can see the microscopic cyan, magenta, and yellow toner dots used to replicate the exact shade of blue." Davenport's eyes widened in sheer horror. He snatched the paper back across the table, pulling a small jeweler's loop from his suit pocket. He held the magnifying lens to his eye, leaning heavily over the signature. The remaining color instantly drained from his face as he saw exactly what Zuri had described. The tiny, perfectly aligned grid of CMYK toner dots forming the letters. The Big Papa never used a ballpoint pen for legal documents. Zuri continued, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. He exclusively used a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen filled with a custom archival-grade iron gall ink. It aggressively bites into the paper. It leaves a permanent textured indentation. This is a flat, two-dimensional laser print. Corinne let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat as the reality of the situation began to set in. And worse, Zuri leaned across the table, locking eyes with her terrified father. The notary seal you stole and stamped over this forgery is dated 5 years ago, but every modern color laser printer utilizes printer steganography. It leaves a nearly invisible matrix of yellow tracking dots across the entire page, encoding the serial number of the printer and the exact date and time the document was produced. I can take this parchment to a forensic digital lab right now, and they will tell a federal judge that this will was printed exactly 48 hours ago. The conference room descended into a suffocating, paralyzing silence. Davenport dropped the jeweler's loupe onto the glass table, physically pushing his chair away from Desmond and Corinne as if they were suddenly radioactive. Which means, Zuri concluded, standing up and buttoning her blazer, you did not just fail to steal the company back. You just handed me physical, irrefutable proof that you fabricated legal evidence during an active FBI investigation. You just committed another federal felony, Dad. And this time, you cannot blame Terrence. Desmond slammed his open palm against the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, but it did nothing to mask the absolute terror flooding his eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at Zuri. You are out of your mind. You are grasping at straws because you know you have lost. Davenport, ignore her. She is stalling. Process the document immediately. But Davenport was already backing away from the table. His expensive suit suddenly looked a size too big as he stared at the aged parchment, treating it as if it were a live grenade. He was a seasoned attorney, and he knew exactly what the penalty was for presenting fabricated evidence in a corporate arbitration involving federal assets. Zuri did not wait for the lawyer to find his spine. She smoothly retrieved her phone from her pocket and tapped a single button. She had known her parents would try one final desperate maneuver. She had planned for it. Less than 60 seconds later, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. A tall, silver-haired man in a sharp gray suit stepped inside, wheeling a heavy, reinforced metallic case behind him. I am officially halting this arbitration, Zuri announced, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Mr. Davenport, meet Dr. Eris Thorne. He is a top-tier forensic document examiner who frequently consults for the Department of Justice. Since you brought newly discovered evidence to the table, I am invoking my legal right to immediate on-site forensic authentication. Desmond stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You cannot do this. This is a private arbitration. If the document is real... Dad, you have absolutely nothing to worry about, Zuri replied, gesturing for Dr. Thorne to proceed. But if you try to leave this room with that parchment, you are tampering with evidence. The tension in the sprawling conference room reached a boiling point. An invisible, heavy pressure settled over the space, making the air feel thick and claustrophobic. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the vintage clock on the wall. Corinne sat entirely paralyzed, her manicured nails digging so deeply into the leather armrests of her chair that her knuckles turned stark white. Desmond remained standing, trapped between his roaring pride and the terrifying realization that his escape route had just been sealed. Dr. Thorne moved with meticulous clinical precision. He snapped on a pair of black nitrile gloves and carefully lifted the supposed miracle will. He placed it flat on the table and opened his metallic case, extracting a portable high-definition spectrometer. He positioned the device directly over the signature line and connected it to his laptop. A harsh, bright blue ultraviolet light swept slowly across the yellowed paper. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting across the chemical readouts populating his screen. He typed a few commands, projecting his laptop's display onto the massive flat screen monitor mounted on the conference room wall. Ms. Davis was highly observant regarding the laser toner anomalies. Dr. Thorne stated, his voice calm and entirely devoid of emotion. However, the forgery is actually much deeper. The perpetrator attempted to mask the printed signature by manually tracing over the lines with a pen to create the physical indentation that a fountain pen would leave. Thorne tapped his keyboard, zooming in on a microscopic cross-section of the ink. The room stared at the jagged, magnified ridges of blue-black pigment displayed on the screen. This is not the archival-grade iron gall ink utilized in Theodore Davis' authentic documents, Thorne explained. This is a highly specific proprietary gel ink hybrid. Specifically, it is from a Japanese-manufactured Uniball Signo series, utilizing a custom blue-black formulation. Thorne turned away from the screen, folding his hands and looking directly at Desmond and Corinne. This specific chemical formulation was not patented, manufactured, or released to the global public until exactly 2 years after Theodore Davis passed away. It is physically impossible for a dead man to have signed a document with a pen that did not yet exist. A choked, strangled gasp escaped Corinne's throat. She slumped back in her chair, all the color draining from her face, leaving her looking hollow and ghost-like. Desmond's jaw went slack. The untouchable patriarch had finally run out of sermons, out of lies, and out of luck. But Dr. Thorne was not finished. He tapped his keyboard again, pulling up a secondary slide. On the left side of the screen was the forged signature and the handwritten date from the fake will. On the right side of the screen was a collection of handwritten church memos and financial authorizations. Zuri had quietly pulled them from the cathedral archives weeks ago, anticipating that her mother would leave a paper trail. Handwriting is biometric. Thorne continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. When an individual attempts to forge a signature, they focus entirely on the shape of the letters. They inevitably forget to mask their own underlying biomechanical habits. Thorne superimposed the 2 writing samples on the monitor. He pointed a laser pointer at the downward strokes, the sharp angles of the letters, and the distinct, aggressive leftward slant of the loops. Notice the heavy, uneven pressure applied to the paper. Notice the micro-hesitations in the curved lines. The biometric pressure signature on this forged will is a flawless 100% match to the handwriting on the right. Thorne lowered the laser pointer and looked at Corinne. You traced this signature yourself, Mrs. Davis. The evidence is indisputable. Davenport let out a loud, horrified gasp. He stumbled backward, knocking his leather briefcase to the floor. The seasoned arbitrator looked at Desmond and Corinne with a mixture of absolute disgust and sheer panic. Forging a legal will to seize control of a multi-million-dollar estate was not just a white-collar misstep. It was a severe, catastrophic felony. And worse, they had dragged Davenport into their scheme, attempting to use his pristine legal license to legitimize their crime. If he did not act immediately, he would be implicated as an accessory to federal fraud. I have absolutely no part in this, Davenport stammered, his hands shaking violently as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. I was presented this document under the false pretense of its authenticity. I am an officer of the court. I am legally obligated to report this immediately. Desmond lunged forward, reaching across the table in a pathetic, desperate attempt to grab the forged will. Davenport, wait. Do not make that call. We can handle this privately. Dr. Thorne smoothly pulled the parchment out of reach and slid it securely into a clear, tamper-evident evidence bag. It is too late for privacy, Desmond, Zuri said softly, watching the complete and utter collapse of her parents' empire. Davenport ignored Desmond's pleas. He dialed the emergency direct line for the local authorities and the federal agents who were already building the embezzlement case against Terrence. Davenport paced the length of the room, his voice frantic as he notified law enforcement that a fraudulent legal document had just been presented in his presence. Corinne buried her face in her trembling hands, quietly sobbing as the walls finally closed in around her. Desmond stared at Zuri, his eyes wide with the terrifying realization that he had underestimated her for her entire life. He had built his golden pedestal on the backs of his wife and daughter, and now the daughter he threw away was standing over the ruins. Zuri did not offer them a shred of sympathy. She simply sat back, folded her hands, and waited for the sirens. The faint, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo through the thick floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown law firm. The sound snapped Desmond out of his paralyzed stupor. The sheer, terrifying reality of a federal forgery charge finally overrode his bottomless arrogance. Fight or flight kicked in, and the patriarch of the Davis Empire chose to run. He snatched his bespoke leather briefcase from the mahogany table, completely ignoring his weeping wife. He turned his back on Zuri and marched toward the heavy double doors of the conference room. He needed to get to his private jet, wire his remaining offshore funds, and disappear before the authorities breached the lobby. He grabbed the brass door handle, but before he could pull it down, a sharp, aggressive vibration erupted in his suit pocket. His cell phone began to ring. Desmond ignored it, yanking on the door. It rang again, louder this time. A second later, Corinne's phone, buried deep in her designer handbag, began to chime with a frantic, continuous shrill. Then the main multi-line phone sitting in the center of the conference table lit up like a Christmas tree. Desmond froze, his hand slipping from the brass handle. He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket. The caller ID flashed the name of his lead administrative pastor. Desmond swiped the screen and brought the device to his ear, barking a harsh command to have his car brought around to the underground loading dock. But there was no polite, subservient response. Instead, the terrified voice of his lead pastor screamed through the receiver, the audio loud enough to bleed into the quiet conference room. The man was hyperventilating, shouting over a chaotic background of crashing doors, heavy boots, and shouting voices. Desmond put the phone on speaker, his hand trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device. "Pastor, what is going on?" Desmond demanded, his voice cracking. "They are everywhere!" Bishop, the pastor, shrieked, sheer panic distorting his voice. "They kicked in the doors to the executive suites. They have guns. They are taking the servers. They are taking the donation ledgers. They locked down the entire building." Desmond's blood ran entirely cold. He looked up, his eyes locking onto his daughter. Zuri was standing at the opposite end of the table, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of absolute, chilling triumph. "You did not genuinely believe I would stop at Terrence, did you?" "Dad," Zuri asked, her voice cutting through the frantic noise radiating from the speakerphone. "Did you really think I would hand my brother over for embezzlement and just ignore the massive tax-exempt washing machine you built to clean his dirty money?" Desmond opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The scope of her vengeance was finally coming into agonizing focus. "While you and Mom were busy playing amateur hour with a color printer and a fake notary seal, I was handing over a decade of forensic accounting to the Internal Revenue Service," Zuri explained, stepping slowly around the table. "I gave them every phantom vendor invoice. I gave them the routing numbers for the offshore accounts you used to hide corporate profits. I gave them the exact dates and times you transferred stolen pension funds through the Cathedral of the Higher Calling, using the church's religious tax exemption to shield your corporate tax evasion." Miles away at the sprawling, immaculate headquarters of the megachurch, the scene Zuri described was unfolding with brutal military precision. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division printed across their backs swarmed the glass and steel complex. They pushed past the velvet ropes in the grand sanctuary. They breached the opulent marble-floored administrative suites. Agents systematically disconnected massive server racks, pulling hard drives and packing decades of fraudulent financial ledgers into heavy plastic evidence bins. The pristine holy empire Desmond had built on the backs of his faithful congregation was being systematically violated by the cold, secular machinery of federal law enforcement. "I triggered a full-scale maximum priority IRS audit." Zuri continued, stopping just a few feet away from her father. "The Criminal Investigation Division does not send audit letters, Dad. They send armed agents. They are currently ripping your ministry apart down to the drywall. Every single operational account connected to the church, the blind trust, and legacy estate management has been frozen by a federal judge." Desmond looked down at the phone in his hand. The line had gone dead. "The offshore crypto wallets Harper surrendered have already been seized by the Treasury Department," Zuri stated, delivering the final fatal blow. "The platinum credit cards currently sitting in your wallet are entirely worthless. The private jet you are trying to run to is grounded. You cannot buy a plane ticket. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. Desmond's knees buckled. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. He stumbled backwards, sinking heavily into one of the plush leather conference chairs. He stared blankly at the wall, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. His life's work, his legacy, his absolute power was gone. It was currently being boxed up in cardboard and hauled away into federal evidence lockers. Corinne remained frozen on the other side of the room, her eyes wide and vacant, completely shattered by the realization that their manufactured royalty had been permanently stripped away. The wail of the police sirens grew deafeningly loud, vibrating against the glass windows as the squad cars pulled up to the curb directly below the law firm. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the conference room. Zuri calmly smoothed the lapels of her blazer, stepped away from her broken parents, and walked toward the door to greet the officers. She had burned the corrupt empire to the ground, and she was the only one walking out of the ashes. The ashes of the Davis Empire were still smoldering when the rats began to scatter. With Desmond facing federal indictment and Terrence locked in a holding cell, the sprawling stolen wealth that had funded their extravagant lives was completely frozen. For Harper Terrence's treacherous wife, the sudden evaporation of her luxury lifestyle was a fate worse than death. Her attempt to extort a comfortable severance package had failed the moment the federal government seized the offshore crypto wallets. Cornered broke and facing imminent divorce from a disgraced felon, Harper decided to play the ultimate untouchable victim card. If she could not extort the money privately, she would manipulate the public into forcing Zura's hand. 3 nights after the IRS raid, Harper appeared on a highly rated primetime local news broadcast. The transformation was sickeningly calculated. The woman who usually paraded around Buckhead in backless designer gowns and heavy diamond jewelry was now wearing a modest, oversized pastel cardigan. Her makeup was minimal, expertly applied to make her look exhausted and fragile. As the broadcast began, the camera executed a slow, deliberate tilt up, starting from her hands, which rested protectively over a remarkably pronounced, yet entirely fabricated baby bump, before snapping to her tear-streaked tragic face. "I did not want to bring this into the public eye," Harper whispered to the sympathetic news anchor, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed vulnerability. "But I am desperate. I am 3 months pregnant with the first Davis grandchild, and my sister-in-law Zuri has completely frozen our accounts and locked me out of my home. She is putting a pregnant woman on the streets out of pure malicious spite. She knows Terrence made mistakes, but punishing an unborn child is just monstrous." Harper let a single flawless tear roll down her cheek as she begged the community for compassion, painting Zuri as a cold, calculating tyrant who was hoarding the family wealth while a defenseless mother and child suffered. The performance worked, at least initially. The public, always hungry for a tragic heroine and a clear villain, momentarily wavered. Social media began to buzz with outrage directed at Zuri. Comment sections filled with people calling her heartless, demanding she release funds for the sake of the innocent baby. The narrative was shifting, threatening to turn Zura's righteous victory into a public relations nightmare. Sitting in her midtown penthouse watching the broadcast on her wall-mounted television, Zuri did not feel a single ounce of panic. She simply took a sip of her sparkling water and opened her laptop. Harper had made a fatal miscalculation. She had forgotten that Zuri was a master auditor, a woman who spent her entire professional life tracking the microscopic digital footprints of liars and thieves. Zuri did not need to argue with Harper on television. She just needed the data. Before the IRS had locked down the cathedral of the higher callings financial servers, Zuri had pulled comprehensive mirrored backups of every single corporate expense account. Terrence had foolishly given Harper a platinum company card years ago, and Harper had treated it like a bottomless personal slush fund. Zuri ran a targeted algorithmic deep dive into Harper's transaction history over the exact 3-month period she was claiming to be pregnant. The results populated on Zuri's screen within seconds, and they were absolutely devastating. Zuri smiled, her eyes scanning the itemized digital receipts. Expectant mothers had strict medical guidelines to follow, but Harper's spending habits, painted the picture of a woman living on the absolute edge of reckless indulgence. Zuri quickly compiled three undeniable, heavily itemized pieces of financial evidence. First, a staggering $10,000 bar tab from an exclusive underground Atlanta nightclub dated just 2 weeks prior. The receipt was not for mocktails or sparkling cider. It detailed multiple bottles of top-shelf unpasteurized imported sake, massive platters of raw high-risk sashimi, and dozens of shots of premium tequila. Second, a $5,000 invoice from a highly discreet elite cosmetic surgery clinic in Beverly Hills dated just 10 days ago. The medical billing codes were specific and itemized. Harper had undergone extensive rounds of Botox injections and dermal fillers procedures that were strictly and universally prohibited for pregnant women due to severe medical risks to the fetus. Third, and most damning of all, was a fully paid, non-refundable booking confirmation for an extreme adventure retreat in the Swiss Alps scheduled for the following month. The itinerary included high-altitude heli-skiing, advanced snowboarding, and a 200-foot bungee jump. It was a rigorous, physically brutal vacation that no doctor on the planet would ever approve for a woman entering her second trimester. Zuri did not post the receipts on her own social media. That would look petty and vindictive. Instead, she packaged the raw, irrefutable data, complete with the digital transaction timestamps and vendor confirmations, and sent it via encrypted email directly to the lead producer of the very same news station that had aired Harper's tearful interview. She attached a single sentence to the file. "I thought your viewers might appreciate some factual context regarding the miracle baby." The news station, realizing they had been utterly humiliated and manipulated by a fraudster on live television, wasted absolutely no time extracting their revenge. The very next evening during the primetime broadcast, the same anchor who had offered Harper a shoulder to cry on went on the offensive. The anchor displayed Harper's tearful face on a split screen right next to the glaring, itemized receipts. In brutal forensic detail, the anchor walked the viewers through the tequila shots, the raw sushi, the Botox injections, and the extreme bungee jumping reservations. The anchor rhetorically asked the audience how a supposedly terrified, desperate, and pregnant mother could possibly be engaging in such reckless, medically prohibited behavior while simultaneously crying poverty. The backlash was instantaneous and catastrophic. The public sympathy that Harper had so carefully cultivated evaporated in a matter of seconds, replaced by a massive wave of absolute disgust and mockery. Social media exploded, but this time, Harper was the target. She was instantly branded a sociopathic grifter, a woman willing to fake a pregnancy to extort money from a broken family. Harper's carefully curated social circles abandoned her overnight. The luxury boutiques she frequented blacklisted her, and the country club revoked her membership pending the federal investigation into her husband's finances. Her phone stopped ringing. The society bloggers who used to praise her outfits now ruthlessly dissected her fake baby bump. Harper was completely exposed, stripped of her false victimhood, and left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of public humiliation. She had tried to go to war against a woman who controlled the data, and in the end the data had entirely consumed her, leaving her an isolated, impoverished pariah in a city that now despised her. With Harper humiliated and completely neutralized, the final battlefield shifted from the court of public opinion back to the cold, sterile reality of corporate law. Desmond had one last desperate card to play. The federal indictments were looming. The IRS was actively tearing through the church's financial history, and his son was sitting in a federal holding cell. Desmond knew his time as a free man was being measured in hours, not days. His only chance of survival was a hostile corporate takeover. If he could legally unseat Zuri as chief executive officer and regain control of legacy estate management, he could liquidate the remaining clean assets, secure a golden parachute, and flee the country before the Department of Justice froze his personal accounts. He called an emergency mandatory meeting of the board of directors. These were not independent overseers. They were the old guard, 7 aging wealthy men handpicked by Desmond over the past decade. They were his cronies, his golf partners, and his accomplices. They had turned a blind eye to Terrence's embezzlement for years, and now they were terrified that the federal sweep would inevitably drag them down as accessories. Desmond had promised them a way out, a massive quiet payout from the corporate reserves if they helped him execute a swift, brutal coup against his daughter. The atmosphere inside the primary boardroom was suffocating. The heavy oak doors were sealed shut. 7 men in expensive suits shifted nervously in their high-backed leather chairs. They kept checking their luxury watches, their polished shoes tapping anxiously against the carpet. Desmond stood at the head of the massive glass table, his face drawn and haggard, but his posture rigidly arrogant. He was attempting to project absolute confidence, but the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead betrayed his sheer panic. The heavy doors swung open. Zuri walked into the boardroom with the calm, terrifying precision of an executioner. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression completely blank. She did not look like a woman fighting for her professional life. She looked like a predator walking into a cage full of trapped prey. She took her seat at the opposite end of the long table, folded her hands, and looked directly at her father. "Let us get this over with," Zuri stated, her voice slicing through the tense silence. Desmond cleared his throat, leaning heavily on the glass table. "We are bypassing the standard quarterly review due to extreme mitigating circumstances. As the founder and former executive of this firm, I have rallied the board to address the catastrophic leadership failures currently threatening our underlying assets." Desmond gestured broadly to the 7 men sitting around the table. "Under the current direction of Zuri Davis, this company has been subjected to federal raids deeply damaging public scandals and extreme financial instability. The board has lost all confidence in her ability to manage the blind trust. Therefore, I am bringing forth a formal motion for a vote of no confidence. We are voting on the immediate termination of Zuri Davis as Chief Executive Officer and the immediate transfer of all executive powers back to myself." Zuri did not flinch. She did not interrupt. She simply leaned back in her chair and surveyed the room. She looked at each of the 7 board members, making deliberate, prolonged eye contact. A few of them looked away in shame, staring down at their polished shoes. Others glared back, fueled by the desperate, greedy promise of Desmond's golden parachutes. "I second the motion," a silver-haired board member muttered, refusing to meet Zuri's gaze. "The motion has been seconded," Desmond declared, a victorious, malicious grin spreading across his sweaty face. "All those in favor of immediately removing Zuri Davis from her position signify by raising your hand." Desmond threw his hand into the air. One by one, the 7 men around the table followed suit. It was unanimous. The old guard had aligned completely with their corrupt patriarch. "The motion carries," Desmond announced, exhaling a massive, trembling breath of relief. He slammed his hand flat against the table. "You are finished, Zuri. You are officially terminated. Surrender your corporate access keys and vacate the building immediately. My security team will escort you to the lobby." Zuri remained perfectly still. She looked at the 8 hands raised in the air, her razor-sharp eyes absorbing the absolute betrayal of the men who had sworn to protect her grandfather's legacy. She slowly reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen twice. The massive ceiling-mounted projector hummed to life. The heavy blackout blinds automatically lowered over the boardroom windows, plunging the room into shadows before the bright glow of the projector screen illuminated the space. "You men are experts in corporate bylaws," Zuri began, her voice echoing with a terrifying absolute chill. "You know every loophole, every clause, and every amendment you helped my father rewrite to slowly bleed this company dry over the last decade. But you forgot something fundamental." Zuri tapped her phone again. A heavily redacted vintage legal document appeared on the massive screen. It was not a modern corporate contract. It was a scanned copy of a decades-old parchment. "You forgot that my grandfather was a brilliant, deeply paranoid man." Zuri continued, standing up and walking slowly around the edge of the glass table. Theodore Davis knew exactly what kind of man his son was. He knew that if he ever passed away, Desmond would immediately rally a room full of greedy sycophants to steal the company. So he did not just protect his assets with corporate bylaws, he protected them in the foundational charter of the blind trust itself. A charter that supersedes every single board resolution you have ever passed. Zuri pointed a sleek laser pointer at the screen, highlighting a specific underlined paragraph near the bottom of the aged document. I direct your attention to Section 4, Paragraph B. Zuri read aloud, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. The Executor Protection Clause. It explicitly states that in the event the designated heir and executor of the blind trust assumes the role of chief executive, any sitting board member who attempts to initiate a hostile removal or votes against the executor without proven federal cause commits a direct violation of their fiduciary duty to the estate. The boardroom fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. The silver-haired board member who had seconded the motion suddenly went entirely pale, his hand dropping slowly to the table. Desmond stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the legal text. "Do you know what the penalty is for violating the Foundational Trust Charter?" Gentleman Zuri asked, stopping right behind her father's chair. "It is called a poison pill. The charter dictates that any board member voting for an unauthorized removal immediately and irrevocably forfeits 100% of their voting shares and their vested equity directly back to the primary estate." A collective gasp echoed around the table. The men began to panic, frantically whispering to each other, their eyes darting between Zuri and the damning document projected on the wall. "That is not legal!" Desmond shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You cannot enforce a 50-year-old ghost clause. We amended the corporate structure years ago." "You amended the corporate structure," Dad Zuri corrected, her tone completely merciless. "But you never legally touched the blind trust. You could not. It was locked in probate until Big Papa passed away. This document is fully registered, federally recognized, and legally binding." Zuri walked back to the head of the table, looking down at the panicked, sweating men who had just tried to destroy her. "You did not just fail to fire me," Zuri stated, pressing a button on the intercom system embedded in the table. "You just voluntarily surrendered every single share of stock you own. You have absolutely no equity, no voting power, and no golden parachutes. You just handed me total uncontested control of legacy estate management." The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. 6 broad-shouldered corporate security guards stepped into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. "Gentlemen," Zuri concluded, her voice devoid of any sympathy, "you are no longer affiliated with this company. You have exactly 5 minutes to clear out your desks under armed supervision before you are permanently escorted from the premises." Desmond collapsed into his chair, completely broken. Zuri had not just defeated the hostile takeover. She had used their own greed to legally execute a flawless, absolute boardroom massacre, wiping the company entirely clean of her father's corruption in less than 5 minutes. The total liquidation of the board of directors stripped Desmond of his final corporate shield, but the immediate crushing reality of his situation did not truly manifest until the first of the month. The sprawling 30,000-square-foot Buckhead estate, a monument to Desmond and Corinne's manufactured royalty, required a staggering monthly mortgage payment. With the IRS freezing every single operational and personal account tied to the blind trust, the automated bank transfers immediately and violently bounced. Desmond, trapped in a house that suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated tomb, refused to accept his poverty. He paced the length of his mahogany-paneled home office, his bespoke suit replaced by wrinkled loungewear. He was a man who had sold salvation for a premium for over 30 years. He firmly believed he possessed one final untouchable safety net, his loyal, adoring congregation. Desmond set up a high-definition camera on his desk and launched a direct live stream to the Cathedral of the Higher Calling's massive digital network. He expected a wave of unconditional love. He put on his best performance, utilizing his booming, authoritative cadence, dropping it to a raspy, emotional whisper, as he claimed his family was under vicious spiritual warfare. He begged his flock for an emergency, untaxed love offering to help their bishop fight the federal government. Desmond watched the live chat populate on his monitor, expecting to see thousands of dollars in donations rolling in. Instead, he watched his legacy burn to the ground in real time. The congregation had read the federal indictments. They had watched the primetime news broadcast detailing Harper's tequila shots and Beverly Hills Botox injections funded by the church's charitable accounts. They knew their hard-earned tithes had been systematically funneled into Terrence's phantom vendor scheme. The live chat became a relentless, merciless firing squad of betrayal and fury. Congregants demanded their money back. They called him a thief, a false prophet, a criminal. Less than 10 minutes into the broadcast, the video feed was abruptly terminated. The church's independent board of deacons had officially locked Desmond out of the network, formally removing him as bishop and severing all ties. The flock had completely abandoned the shepherd who had been shearing them blind. Without the church's money, the bank moved with ruthless, lethal speed. The very next morning, the world seemed to violently stretch and warp around Desmond as he stood on his front porch staring at the bright neon-colored piece of paper securely taped to his custom mahogany front doors. It was an official expedited notice of foreclosure. The bank was reclaiming the property and placing the estate on the immediate private auction block. For 2 weeks, Desmond and Corinne lived like ghosts in their own home. The landscaping overgrew. The pool turned a murky, unmaintained green. Corinne spent her days wandering the dark, echoing halls, crying over the impending loss of her crystal chandeliers and imported Italian marble. Desmond sat in the dark, drinking cheap liquor, waiting for the bank's auctioneers to physically drag them onto the street. The estate went to a closed-door, private cash auction. Desmond assumed a faceless real estate conglomerate or a rival megachurch pastor would buy the property for pennies on the dollar. He was only half right. At exactly 8 in the morning on a Tuesday, the heavy wrought iron security gates at the base of the driveway swung open. Desmond, looking out the second-story window through the heavy silk drapes, watched a sleek black town car glide smoothly up the winding circular driveway. He grabbed Corinne by the arm, dragging her down the grand sweeping staircase to the foyer. They stood by the heavy front doors, bracing themselves for the bank representatives or the county sheriff. The doorbell chimed. Desmond pulled the doors open, his face twisted into a mask of bitter, exhausted defiance. Zuri stood on the front porch. She wore a pristine, tailored white suit, completely untouched by the chaos she had unleashed upon her family. She held a single crisp manila folder in her right hand. "What are you doing here?" Corinne hissed, stepping out from behind Desmond, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have taken everything. Are you here to gloat while the bank throws us out?" Zuri stepped over the threshold, not waiting for an invitation. She walked slowly into the grand foyer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She looked up at the massive crystal chandelier, then back down to her ruined parents. "The bank is not throwing you out, Mom," Zuri stated, her voice calm, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I am." Desmond let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You do not have the authority." The bank foreclosed. The property was auctioned yesterday morning to an anonymous corporate buyer. Zuri smoothly opened the manila folder and extracted a stack of legally certified notarized property deeds. She held them out, forcing Desmond to take them. "The property was purchased at auction by Apex Holdings, LLC," Zuri explained, watching her father's eyes scan the paperwork. "A private data security firm paid exactly $4.2 million in cash to satisfy the outstanding bank liens and secure total ownership of the deed. If you look at the executive signature on the final page of that packet, Dad, you will notice exactly who is listed as the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings." Desmond flipped to the back page. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The signature was Zuri's. She had used the massive, entirely legitimate profits from her data architecture firm to buy her parents' home out from under them in a single devastating cash transaction. "You bought the house," Corinne whispered, the reality crashing down on her like a physical blow. "You bought our home." "It is a prime piece of real estate," Zuri replied, maintaining her cold, calculated composure. "I plan to completely gut the interior, modernize the layout, and flip it to a commercial tech executive by the end of the year. I have contractors scheduled to begin the demolition process tomorrow morning." Zuri reached back into the folder and pulled out one final piece of paper. She stepped forward and pressed it directly against Desmond's chest. "This is an official court-certified 24-hour eviction notice," Zuri declared, locking eyes with her father. You have exactly 1 day to pack whatever personal clothing and basic necessities you can fit into your car. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, and every fixture in this house now belongs to my LLC. If you are still standing on this property at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will have you both arrested for criminal trespassing. Desmond stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked around the grand foyer, realizing that the walls that had protected his arrogance for decades now legally belonged to the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. Zuri turned on her heel and walked calmly back out the front doors, leaving her parents standing in the echoing silence of a castle they no longer owned. 12 hours later, the sprawling Davis mansion was a chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes and packing tape. Desmond and Corinne were frantically stuffing their designer clothes into suitcases, their movements jerky and devoid of their usual refined grace. But their humiliating packing process was abruptly interrupted by a mandatory summons. Zuri had dispatched a private courier with a strict directive demanding their immediate presence at her corporate headquarters to sign the final property relinquishment forms. Failure to appear would result in the immediate seizure of their remaining personal vehicles. Defeated and stripped of all leverage, Desmond and Corinne arrived at the sleek glass-walled offices of Legacy Estate Management. They bypassed the receptionist and walked heavily into Zuri's private executive suite. They expected to find their daughter waiting with a stack of sterile legal documents. Instead, they walked into a scene that completely shattered whatever fragile remnants of their reality still existed. A soft, steady tracking shot moved gracefully across the polished hardwood floor, capturing the quiet innocence of a young 5-year-old boy sitting on a plush geometric rug. He was entirely engrossed in building a complex tower out of colorful wooden architectural blocks, blissfully unaware of the suffocating tension in the room. The camera slowly tilted upward, contrasting the child's peaceful play against Zuri's fierce, unyielding demeanor as she stood protectively behind her expansive mahogany desk. Sitting nervously on the leather sofa to Zuri's right was a young woman with tired but kind eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Desmond stopped dead in his tracks. Corinne let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her designer handbag slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. They did not need an introduction. The little boy looking up from his wooden blocks had the exact same striking hazel eyes, the exact same jawline, and the exact same smile as their golden child Terrence. Zuri watched the color completely drain from her parents' faces. She did not offer them a seat. "You both look like you have seen a ghost," Zuri said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the silence of the office. "But he is very real, and he is very much a Davis." Desmond swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the young woman on the sofa and the boy on the floor. "What is the meaning of this, Zuri? Why is she here? We had an arrangement." "An arrangement," Zuri repeated, tasting the bitter cruelty of the word. "You mean the pitiful, extortionate payoff you forced onto a terrified 22-year-old girl to protect your precious brand?" Zuri walked around her desk and stood beside the woman. "Mom. Dad. You remember Maya? 5 years ago, when Terrence was busy posing for magazine covers and preaching purity to your youth congregation, he got Maya pregnant. He was perfectly willing to abandon her, but you two realized a fatherless child out of wedlock would destroy Terrence's pristine golden boy image. It would ruin the succession plan. It would tarnish the wholly untouchable veneer of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling." Corinne stepped forward, her voice shaking with desperate panic. "We did what we had to do to protect this family. You do not understand the pressure, the public scrutiny." "I understand exactly what you did," Zuri fired back, her eyes narrowing with absolute disgust. "You cornered a pregnant, financially vulnerable girl. You threatened her with total legal and social ruin. You forced her to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements and paid her a pathetic one-time lump sum of $50,000 to disappear and never claim Terrence as the father. You threw away your own flesh and blood, your own grandson, just to protect a public relations strategy." Zuri walked back to her desk, tapping the screen of her tablet. She turned the device around, projecting a series of highly encrypted financial ledgers onto the large monitor mounted on her office wall. "But you underestimated my network." Zuri continued, her tone shifting to the clinical absolute precision of a master data architect. I found out about Maya and little Leo almost immediately. While you two were busy funding Terrence's luxury sports cars and offshore crypto accounts, I stepped in. Desmond's eyes widened in shock as he read the financial transfers illuminating the screen. For the past 5 years, I have been quietly routing funds from my personal consulting firm to support them. Zuri stated, her voice echoing with undeniable pride. I paid for Leo's premium health care. I paid his preschool tuition. I ensured Maya had a safe, secure apartment in a good neighborhood and the capital to finish her degree. I did the job that Terrence was too cowardly to do, and that you two were too morally bankrupt to even consider. Corinne began to weep silently, the crushing weight of her own hypocrisy finally breaking her. She had spent decades parading around Atlanta as a paragon of maternal virtue, while her actual grandson was hidden away like a dirty secret. You preach about family values every single Sunday, Zuri said, her voice dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. You stand at the pulpit and demand absolute morality from thousands of working-class people. Yet the second your own image was threatened, you discarded an innocent child without a second thought. You called me a disappointment my entire life because I did not fit your perfect corporate mold. But I am the only one in this room who actually understands what family means. Desmond tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He looked at little Leo, who was now holding up a wooden block, smiling innocently at the strangers in the room. The physical resemblance to Terrence was undeniable, a living, breathing testament to Desmond's greatest failure. I have digitized the extortion contracts you forced Maya to sign, Zuri announced, pulling a sleek black flash drive from her desk drawer and tossing it onto the glass table. I also pulled the exact routing numbers from the church accounts you used to quietly wire her that pitiful hush money. I have compiled the evidence into 4 specific digital files. You can review them in the archive. They are labeled exactly as duyanmao1_21.docx, duyanmao2_21.docx, duyanmao3_21.docx, and duyanmao4_21.docx. Zuri crossed her arms, her fierce protective stance creating an impenetrable barrier between her parents and the young boy. These files prove that you used untaxed charitable church donations to cover up your son's reckless behavior, Zuri concluded, delivering the final fatal blow. I have already forwarded these exact files to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They will be adding felony misuse of charitable funds and extortion to your pending federal indictments. The room descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. Desmond and Corinne stood completely paralyzed, their eyes locked on the flash drive sitting on the table. They had come to the office hoping to salvage some tiny fraction of their dignity, but Zuri had systematically stripped them of their wealth, their freedom, and now their last remaining shred of moral superiority. Sign the property relinquishment forms on the table and leave my office, Zuri commanded, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Your movers are waiting at the mansion, and I expect you both off my property by tomorrow morning. You have no family left to manipulate. You have no legacy left to protect. You are completely and utterly finished. The hours bled into the late evening, casting long, sharp shadows across the executive suite. Zuri sat alone in the quiet darkness of the building. She had spent the afternoon systematically freezing the last of the compromised corporate accounts, ensuring that Apex Holdings absorbed the remaining clean assets without triggering any further federal tripwires. She was just closing her laptop when the heavy glass doors to her office slowly pushed open. Desmond stood in the doorway. He was completely alone. Zuri had explicitly instructed the night shift security team to let him up. She knew her father's psychological profile better than anyone. A narcissist entirely stripped of his audience, his wealth, and his power would inevitably return to the source of his destruction for one final, desperate attempt at manipulation. The physical transformation of the man standing before her was staggering. The immaculate, commanding patriarch of the Davis family, the man who had effortlessly captivated millions of parishioners with a single smile, was entirely gone. His bespoke suit jacket was missing. His silk tie was violently yanked loose, and his usually perfectly groomed hair stood up in erratic, sweaty tufts. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting wildly around the room. He reeked of cheap liquor and stale sweat. He did not look like a man of God. He looked like a cornered, terrified animal. Desmond stepped into the room and locked the heavy door behind him with a loud, definitive click. He did not bother with pleasantries. He did not attempt to invoke the Lord, quote scripture, or play the role of the righteous victim. He dropped the holy facade, completely revealing the calculating, ruthless grifter that had always lurked beneath the expensive vestments. He paced the length of the hardwood floor, his expensive dress shoes scuffing harshly against the polish. His breathing was ragged, his hands shaking so violently he had to stuff them into his pockets to hide the tremors. "I have other accounts," Desmond blurted out, his voice a frantic, raspy whisper. "Offshore entities, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland that I set up decades ago. Corinne knows nothing about them. Terrence knows nothing about them. The IRS does not have the routing numbers, and the federal prosecutors have not subpoenaed the holding companies because they do not even know where to look." Desmond stopped pacing and rushed toward Zura's desk. He planted his trembling hands flat against the mahogany surface, leaning in close, his face slick with perspiration. "There is over $4 million in clean, untraceable liquid cash sitting in a trust under a fictitious name. I will transfer total ownership to you tonight. I will sign a full unredacted confession claiming sole responsibility for the vendor embezzlement scheme. I will completely exonerate Terrence, and I will take the entire fall for the federal fraud charges. I will give you everything I have left." Zuri did not blink. She leaned back in her leather chair, her expression a mask of absolute unyielding ice. "And what exactly do you want in exchange for this ultimate sacrifice, Dad?" Desmond swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his cheek. "I want the church. I want my legacy. I want you to use your leverage with the federal prosecutors to arrange a quiet plea deal, but most importantly, I want you to force the Board of Deacons to let me retain my title. I want to stand at the pulpit of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling one last time. I want to tell my congregation that my failing health requires me to step down. I want to retire as Bishop Emeritus. I need to keep my dignity. I cannot let them see me as a common thief. I cannot be publicly humiliated." Zuri stared at the man looming over her desk. It was a profound, deeply sickening revelation. Facing decades in federal prison, complete financial ruin, and the total destruction of his family, Desmond's only genuine concern was his ego. He was perfectly willing to plead guilty to federal crimes, abandon his wife to poverty, and surrender his secret fortune as long as he could keep his imaginary honorary title. He cared more about the applause of strangers than he cared about the survival of his own flesh and blood. "No," Zuri stated, her voice slicing through his frantic delusion with surgical precision. "There are no deals, there are no grand farewell speeches. You do not get to rewrite your history, and you certainly do not get to dictate the terms of your own surrender. The evidence has already been submitted to the Department of Justice. Your secret offshore accounts will be flagged by morning. You are going to prison, and the whole world is going to know exactly what kind of monster you truly are." The rejection snapped whatever fragile restraint Desmond had left. His desperation instantly mutated into blinding, explosive rage. He let out a guttural, furious roar and lunged across the desk. His hands flew toward Zura's throat, his face twisting into a mask of pure, violent malice. "I made you!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You are nothing without the Davis name. I will tell the press you manipulated the data. I will tell the prosecutors you orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme to steal the company. I will destroy you, you ungrateful, vindictive little girl." Zuri did not flinch. She did not reach for the security panic button under her desk. She did not even lean away from his grasping, violent hands. She simply sat there perfectly still, staring directly into the terrified, broken eyes of the man who had grounded her, humiliated her, and tried to destroy her spirit for 30 years. She watched his hands shake inches from her face, recognizing that he was completely powerless. The terrifying giant of her childhood, was just a hollow shell entirely consumed by his own lies. Desmond froze. His raised fist shook violently as the reality of his utter impotence finally crushed him. He slowly lowered his hands, stumbling backward away from the desk. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He was a pathetic, broken man entirely stripped of his holy armor, weeping over the ruins of his stolen empire. Zuri stood up slowly, towering over the weeping patriarch. She looked down at him without a single ounce of pity, her voice echoing through the quiet office with absolute devastating finality. "The truth is the only thing that will set you free, Bishop." The silence that followed her final words was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on Desmond as he remained crumpled on the hardwood floor. He had nothing left to say, no sermons to preach, and no lies left to spin. Zuri turned her back on him, signaling the end of the meeting and the definitive end of his reign. Hours later, the sun began its slow, majestic ascent over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, piercing rays of morning light across the glass and steel architecture of the city. As the dawn broke, the final inescapable reality of the Davis family's destruction was set into motion. There was no shouting, no desperate negotiating, and no grand speeches. The events unfolded with the terrifying rhythmic precision of a ticking clock set to an unspoken, soaring operatic crescendo that seemed to hum beneath the very pavement of the city. A fleet of black, unmarked federal SUVs arrived in perfect synchronization at the upscale hotel where Desmond had spent his final hours of freedom. Federal agents in tactical gear poured through the revolving glass doors, their movements swift and completely silent. They bypassed the terrified concierge and took the elevator directly to the penthouse suite. The heavy polished door was breached without hesitation. Desmond was found sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, staring blankly at the wall, completely motionless. The agents did not offer him the courtesy of a private exit. They pulled his arms behind his back, the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs ratcheting tight against his wrists with a sharp metallic click. As Desmond was escorted out through the hotel lobby, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated his pale, haggard face. A swarm of local and national news cameras had already gathered on the sidewalk, tipped off by the sweeping federal indictments unsealed just moments before. The blinding white flashes of the cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing the spectacular, devastating fall of the city's most untouchable religious icon. Desmond ducked his head, his shoulders hunched in absolute disgrace, as he was shoved into the back of a waiting SUV. Miles away, the morning light filtered through the narrow, reinforced windows of a federal holding facility. Terrence, the anointed golden boy of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling, was being formally processed for transfer. He had been stripped of his tailored designer suits, and imported silk ties replaced entirely by the harsh, abrasive fabric of an orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit. 2 federal marshals flanked him, securely shackling his ankles and fastening a heavy chain around his waist. Terrence dragged his feet across the cold concrete floor, the heavy iron chains clanking loudly with every step. The arrogant, charming smirk that had effortlessly manipulated thousands of parishioners was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare of pure terror. He looked up at the television monitor mounted in the processing room, watching the breaking news chyron display his own face next to the words "Federal Wire Fraud" and "Embezzlement Indictments." Simultaneously, the bustling international terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport was operating at peak morning capacity. Harper, terrified of the impending federal sweep and desperate to avoid being charged as a criminal accessory to her husband's schemes, was executing a frantic escape plan. She wore oversized dark sunglasses and a wide silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head, desperately trying to blend in with the chaotic crowd of business travelers. She clutched a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland, silently praying that her offshore accounts had not yet been seized. Harper stepped up to the TSA security checkpoint, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. She slid her passport across the stainless steel counter, offering the agent a tight, artificial smile. The agent swiped the document through the digital scanner. A sharp red warning screen immediately illuminated the monitor. The agent did not hand the passport back. Instead, he pressed a silent alarm beneath the desk. Within seconds, 6 armed Customs and Border Protection officers converged on the checkpoint, completely surrounding her. Harper's artificial composure instantly shattered. She began to shriek wildly, thrashing her arms and demanding to speak to a manager, screaming that she was a wealthy, influential woman who was being targeted. The officers were entirely unmoved by her aristocratic tantrums. They grabbed her arms, forcing her wrists together as the handcuffs snapped shut. Hundreds of travelers stopped to watch, pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. As Harper was publicly humiliated, dragged away from the checkpoint, kicking and screaming, her designer sunglasses trampled and crushed under the boots of the passing crowd. Back in Buckhead, the heavy wrought iron gates of the massive Davis estate slowly swung shut, locking permanently with a heavy electronic thud. The moving trucks had already departed, taking the entirety of the home's luxurious contents to an anonymous corporate storage facility. Corinne stood entirely alone on the concrete curb outside the gates. She was wearing a plain, unbranded trench coat, shivering slightly in the crisp morning air. Stripped of her honorary titles, her sprawling mega mansion, and her deeply corrupted golden child, she had absolutely nothing left. At her feet sat 2 cheap, heavily scuffed fabric suitcases holding the meager, unbranded personal items she had been permitted to pack. She looked up at the towering, empty estate that had once been her kingdom. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of her isolation finally broke her. Corinne collapsed onto her knees on the cold concrete, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ragged, uncontrollable sobs. There was no congregation to comfort her. There were no socialites to offer their sympathies. There was only the empty street and the devastating silence of a woman who had traded her soul for a status she could not keep. High above the city, bathed in the warm golden light of the morning sun, Zuri sat behind the massive mahogany desk in her pristine executive office. The room was perfectly quiet, a serene sanctuary elevated far above the chaotic wreckage she had orchestrated. On the far wall, a bank of high-definition monitors silently broadcasted the breaking news across every major network. The split screens displayed the complete annihilation of the Davis Empire. Desmond being forced into a federal vehicle, Terrence doing a perp walk in chains, Harper screaming in the airport terminal. Zuri leaned back in her leather chair, her posture relaxed but commanding. She picked up a steaming mug of black coffee, taking a slow, measured sip. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched the screens, her dark eyes unblinking and fiercely focused. The cancer that had infected her grandfather's legacy had been surgically, flawlessly removed. The blind trust was secure, the corporate assets were clean, and the innocent had been protected. The war was over, and Zuri Davis had won. A fluid, sweeping crane shot moves gracefully through the newly acquired corporate headquarters of Apex Holdings. The oppressive gilded extravagance that had defined the Davis family legacy is being systematically dismantled in real time. Teams of contractors in slate-gray uniforms are hauling away the heavy mahogany desks, the imposing leather chairs, and the ostentatious oil paintings that Desmond had used to project his untouchable authority. In their place, sleek, transparent glass partitions and modern minimalist workstations are being assembled. The visual metaphor is unmistakable. The era of dark secrets and closed-door corruption is permanently over. The new regime operates entirely in the light. The camera glides seamlessly into the main executive boardroom, capturing Zuri at the absolute center of the storm. A fast-paced montage of raw efficiency and relentless progress begins. Zuri stands at the head of a massive illuminated digital conference table. She is surrounded by a team of elite forensic accountants, corporate liquidators, and federal compliance officers. She moves with the surgical precision of a general who has just conquered enemy territory. She points to glowing financial schematics on the interactive screens, her directives sharp and immediate. With the rot surgically removed from her life, Zuri gets to work. She aggressively liquidates the corrupt branches of legacy estate management. The camera captures close-up shots of her signature flashing across dozens of digital authorization forms. She meticulously traces the fraudulent routing numbers, identifying the exact charitable endowments her father had hijacked to fund his secret offshore accounts. With a few keystrokes and a flurry of verified digital signatures, She legally repatriates the stolen capital. She signs the orders to seize and sell the private jets, the luxury vehicle fleets, and the fraudulent real estate portfolios that Terrence had used to launder his embezzlement payouts. The massive ill-gotten profits that the Davis men had hoarded for decades are systematically drained from their hidden vaults. Zuri watches the ledgers zero out her expression, a mask of absolute focus. She is not merely destroying her father's empire, she is purifying it. The sweeping crane shot accelerates, pushing through the glass walls and soaring upward to a newly renovated sunlit floor of the building. The sterile, ruthless corporate atmosphere instantly gives way to an environment vibrating with collaborative energy and vibrant ambition. This is the culmination of Zuri's master plan. The camera tilts upward to reveal a beautifully designed brushed steel logo mounted on the main architectural wall. It reads, "The Pearl Foundation." Zuri has taken the millions of dollars recovered from the liquidated Davis assets and redirected them entirely into a massive multi-million-dollar corporate incubator. The sprawling space is bustling with brilliant-driven Black female entrepreneurs in the finance, technology, and real estate sectors. The montage captures Zuri in her element, completely transformed from the guarded, defensive woman she was forced to be around her family. She is smiling, shaking hands, and reviewing business plans with young visionary founders. She is authorizing massive seed capital grants and providing the high-level executive mentorship that she was entirely denied by her own parents. Zuri is using the wealth extracted from her family's deception to build a powerful, bulletproof network of female innovators. She has turned the ultimate symbol of her father's greed into a fortress of genuine economic empowerment. The triumphant, soaring musical score suddenly cuts out. The camera drops sharply, executing a jarring, visceral transition away from the bright, soaring architecture of Zuri's new empire. The scene plunges into the harsh, unflattering fluorescent lighting of a high-end retail boutique in the wealthy shopping district of Buckhead. The atmosphere is quiet, sterile, and dripping with an arrogant exclusivity. Standing behind a polished glass jewelry display case is Corinne Davis. The contrast is absolutely staggering. The former matriarch of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling, the woman who had spent 30 years draped in bespoke couture and demanding total submission from everyone in her orbit, is now wearing a stiff, poorly fitted black polyester retail uniform. A cheap plastic name tag is pinned awkwardly to her lapel. Her posture, once rigidly defined by aristocratic superiority, is visibly broken. She is hunched forward, her face drawn and deeply lined with exhaustion. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her untouchable social standing, she has been forced to take a minimum-wage retail job just to survive. Corinne is meticulously folding a stack of silk scarves, her hands moving with a slow, mechanical numbness. She carefully places each scarf back onto the display shelf, her eyes devoid of any remaining spark. The gentle chime of the boutique door breaks the silence. A group of impeccably dressed, wealthy older women enter the store. They are carrying designer shopping bags and laughing loudly, their voices carrying an air of absolute entitlement. Corinne freezes. Her breath hitches in her throat. She recognizes them immediately. They are the exact high society churchwomen she once ruled with an iron fist. They are the same women who used to hang on her every word at exclusive charity galas, the women who used to jockey for a position next to her in the VIP pews every Sunday. A desperate, pathetic flicker of hope crosses Corinne's face. She instinctively straightens her spine, attempting to summon a fraction of her former grandeur. She steps out from behind the glass counter, her lips parting to offer a gracious, familiar greeting, hoping against all reason for a shred of the respect she once commanded so effortlessly. The women walk right past her. They do not pause. They do not offer a polite nod. They actively look right through her as if she were made of glass. One of the women, a prominent socialite whose wedding Corinne had personally officiated, glances in her direction for a fraction of a second. Her expression instantly turns to stone, a mask of cold, unyielding dismissal. She averts her eyes, turning her back to Corinne completely as she examines a rack of expensive handbags. Corinne is entirely invisible. The socialite queen has been reduced to a nameless, irrelevant servant in the very world she helped build. The sharp click of the socialite's designer heels against the marble floor echoes in Corinne's ears like a judge's gavel. One of the women casually holds up a cashmere wrap, waving her hand impatiently in Corinne's direction without bothering to make eye contact. She snaps her fingers, demanding a different size in a tone usually reserved for a disobedient child. Corinne's throat tightens. The urge to scream to assert her former dominance burns in her chest, but the terrifying reality of her past, due rent, and looming legal bills, forces her to swallow her pride. She realizes with crushing clarity that her power was never real. It was entirely purchased with stolen money, and without it, she is nothing. She nods silently, a subservient ghost, and scurries to the stockroom to fetch the garment. She is an exiled prisoner trapped in a brutal minimum wage reality. The camera cuts back to Zuri, finalizing the absolute undeniable contrast. Zuri is standing alone on the expansive outdoor balcony of her penthouse office. The warm Atlanta sun is shining brightly, casting a golden glow over her features. She leans against the glass railing, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The city is no longer a playground for her family's corruption. It is a canvas for her own vision. The heavy, suffocating chains of the Davis family legacy have been permanently shattered. She breathes in the crisp air, a look of profound, unshakable peace settling over her face. She has survived the destruction, cleansed the rot, and finally claimed her own extraordinary future. The camera opens tight on Zura's face. The golden hour light of Atlanta pours through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, casting a warm, victorious glow across her features. There is no trace of the guarded, defensive posture that once defined her miserable existence within the Davis family. Instead, her expression radiates a profound, unshakable peace. A full year has passed since the violent, spectacular collapse of her father's corrupt empire. In that time, the ashes of legacy estate management have been completely swept away, replaced by the towering ethical titan that Apex Holdings has become. While Zuri reviews the quarterly impact reports for the Pearl Foundation, her mind briefly touches upon the stark reality of those who tried to destroy her. Hundreds of miles away, confined within the bleak concrete walls of a federal penitentiary, Terrence is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence. Stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury sports cars, and his insufferable golden boy arrogance, he is now just another inmate assigned to laundry duty. The federal prosecutors showed no mercy regarding his extensive tax evasion and embezzlement schemes. The pristine, untouchable image he had weaponized against Zuri his entire life is entirely obliterated. He spends his days folding harsh institutional uniforms, existing in a brutal, monotonous reality that completely shatters the illusion of his divine superiority. Harper's attempt to salvage her own aristocratic lifestyle failed just as spectacularly. The moment the federal indictments were unsealed, she swiftly filed for divorce, desperately hoping to sever her legal and financial ties to Terrence's sinking ship. But the Department of Justice was exceptionally thorough. With all of their joint assets, offshore accounts, and luxury properties seized by the government, Harper was left absolutely penniless. The woman who once spent her afternoons hosting lavish country club luncheons and mocking working-class people is now clocking in for grueling minimum wage shifts as a hostess at a loud, chaotic chain restaurant. She spends her evenings forcing fake smiles for rude customers, handing out sticky laminated menus, and clearing dirty tables. She is completely invisible to the high society circle that immediately exiled her, trapped in a relentless cycle of financial panic and profound public humiliation. And then there is Desmond, the once invincible patriarch of the Cathedral of the Higher Calling. The man who demanded godlike reverence from millions is now living in total obscurity. Excommunicated from the church he built and disgraced on a national stage, he resides alone in a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. He has no congregation, no pulpit, and no legacy. The deafening silence of his isolation is the ultimate punishment for a narcissist who fed entirely on the adoration of others. He spends his days staring at the peeling wallpaper of his tiny living room, a pathetic, broken man completely forgotten by the world he tried to manipulate. Zuri looks down at the sleek digital tablet resting on her desk. She taps the screen, opening the final sealed dockets from the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division that officially closed the book on the Davis family syndicate. The digital archives contain the comprehensive legal proof of her victory, mapping the massive transfer of wealth that she legally ripped from her abusers. She scrolls past the final transfer deeds, her eyes scanning the precise legal documentation of the wealth she clawed back from the brink of ruin. The files are securely archived in her highly encrypted private server, permanently labeled as duyanmao1_25.docx, duyanmao2_25.docx, duyanmao3_25.docx, and duyanmao4_25.docx. These files represent much more than just financial ledgers or legal summaries. They are the tangible, indisputable proof of her survival and her absolute dominance over the people who tried to bury her. The Pearl Foundation had exceeded every projection she had ever mapped out. What began as a multi-million-dollar incubator had rapidly evolved into a global phenomenon. Zuri had successfully funded dozens of Black female-led startups in the finance and technology sectors, actively dismantling the systemic barriers that her own father had ruthlessly upheld. She had replaced the toxic predatory culture of legacy estate management with an ecosystem built entirely on integrity, mutual elevation, and unapologetic brilliance. She walked through the halls of her company not with the terrifying, tyrannical presence of Desmond Davis, but with the commanding, inspiring grace of a true leader. The women she mentored did not cower in her presence. They thrived, building their own wealth and securing their own futures because Zuri had cleared the path. Zuri did not simply endure the severe scapegoat trauma inflicted upon her by her toxic, abusive family. She did not merely survive their relentless gaslighting, their financial extortion, or their desperate, pathetic attempts to crush her spirit. She took their weaponized arrogance, their blinding narcissism, and their absolute certainty that she would fail, and she used it to construct an impenetrable fortress of success. She transformed decades of familial abuse into the high-octane fuel required to achieve ultimate Black excellence. She had built a massively successful corporate empire that operated with absolute transparency and raw, undeniable power. Zuri reaches across her polished mahogany desk and picks up a custom ceramic mug. She takes a slow, savoring sip of her hot tea. As the warm liquid soothes her throat, a genuine, brilliant smile breaks across her face. It is a smile of total, uncompromised victory. The camera slowly begins to track backward, pulling away from the warmth of her office. The shot glides fluidly through the pristine glass window, floating out into the crisp evening air to reveal the vast, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretch out like a sea of diamonds, a sprawling, beautiful kingdom that Zuri conquered entirely on her own terms. The triumphant image holds for a long, resonant moment before the screen slowly fades to a deep, absolute black.